And it's basically Jacob versus Esau, because it's the church versus the Herods, who were descended from Esau. And it's like they're struggling in the womb to see who's going to be the firstborn, who's going to get the inheritance. That's what it's about.
All I could see was this light coming in.
The Holy Spirit went, it blew into me.
I have never been the same since then.
That was it. I'm done.
I was born again.
Welcome to the Weird Christian Podcast. I am your host, Samuel Delgado, and this is episode 79. I interview Michael Bull about the book of Revelation, and let me just go ahead and tell you, this one is not for the faint of heart. This is the longest episode I've done up until this point, but Michael said that he had no time limit, so we went for it. We talk about, of course, the book of Revelation. We cover it from the Partial-Preterist, Post-millennial view, but within the conversation, man, we really kind of get into everything, as of course, the study of Revelation is a study of the entire Bible. So, hope you enjoy it. This is one you may need to run back as we get into the weeds. So, with no further ado, let's get weird. Welcome to the show. Like I was saying, I'm pumped to be doing this. I mean, as we were kind of talking, this being weird, eschatology is kind of like my wheelhouse as far as what we're covering, and I have not had someone come on. I guess I have had a preterist come on before, but we didn't touch the book of Revelation. We talked mostly about the Olivet Discourse. And anyway, so that actually, since that guest kind of sent me on this, journey. I've had G.K. Bill on to kind of give his position. I've had a lot of futurists. So this will be the first time to go over the book of Revelation from a preterist standpoint. So I'm pumped to do that. Anyway, and so I'll just say off the top, man, if you're like me, I know you said this in your book. There's people that will shy away from the book of Revelation because they believe it's unknowable, and then there's people that obsess, and that's definitely me. It's just been, I'm trying to crack it and figure it out, and I've not heard a real good, a really solid interpretation. But I think the preterist view, if I'm being honest, I think the preterist view is the one that's being the most honest with the actual text itself. And I have not embraced it because of, and you're covering this from a different standpoint. My biggest thing with not fully embracing preterism is because most of it hinges on the writings of Josephus and the Jewish wars. And when I hear interpreters talk about it and they rely so heavily on it, I'm like, I mean, that's great and all, but it comes across, I don't know the word for it. It's like, I mean, really? It's like the whole thing's based off of Josephus, and it's just, it's kind of like a house of cards. I can't roll with that.
Yeah, the question I had there was, and that's when I read David Chilton's commentary, which was my first introduction to preterism.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh yeah, I hear you fine.
Yeah, great. Was why would the key to this book of prophecy be outside of the Bible? That was my question.
Oh, yeah.
And it didn't really sort of make sense. So when I came across James Jordan's interpretation, who was from the same school, but he developed things a bit more, and his key is the Old Testament, and that's how the whole Bible works. It's so self-referencing. And when I saw how he operated and was listening to his lectures, I thought, he is the first person I've ever heard who can actually make sense of the details and with such ease simply by going to the Old Testament. And what I realized was it's akin to meme warfare. Like it's the same. The Bible uses the same memes over and over again and just kind of adjust them for a new purpose. And we're supposed to get the jokes. And so Revelation has its meme warfare, and the people who, hopefully the Jewish rulers, in some sense at least, if they had any access to it, and the New Testament in general, when Jesus was preaching, they would have understood what he meant when he referred to the Old Testament, things that we don't always get, that it would have hit the mark. And we use memes to engage people, and Jesus and the apostles used the Old Testament to engage people, but we don't know the Old Testament well enough, so they mystify us. So we're not getting the jokes. That's the problem.
Yeah, no, you're right. And man, I've just been on a tear reading through James Jordan's stuff, and it's unbelievable, man. So you kind of got us going a little bit, but I want to back up a little bit and just have you give the listener a little bit of background as far as who you are and what got you into Bible prophecy.
Okay. Well, I'm a graphic designer, so but I'm a visual thinker, and always have been. And I think if you're going to understand the Bible, you have to think visually, because it's not just dealing in imagery, but it's also dealing in architecture. And unless you can think spatially and in various sort of domains and constructs, you're going to struggle. And if you don't recognize certain arrangements as they appear again and again, I'll give an example. If you had the two bronze pillars in Solomon's temple at the entrance, and in the book of Ezekiel, the pillar of fire of the Lord is standing on the threshold. Now, if you can't, firstly, you need to understand that those two pillars represented the two trees in the Garden of Eden. But also then, if you don't notice that the glory of the Lord standing between these two pillars has a correspondence with Samson standing between the two pillars in the Philistine temple, and the same imagery comes up again and again and again. You think, okay, what is this third pillar? That's where, and God he doesn't explain himself. He's like, I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to show you. And unless you start to, and the two cherubim at the entrance to the garden with the flaming sword, the single flaming sword between them. The same construct comes up again and again, and made of different things, but and Samson's name means sunrise, and so he's this brightness shining, even though he had no eyes, which is part of the joke. So unless you think spatially, you're going to struggle. But also too, the other thing is that the Bible's made of repeated sequences, and it's like it is a bit like strands of DNA, in the sense that the same sequences get replayed over and over like a tune, but in different ways, sometimes major, sometimes minor. And we're supposed to pick that up in the same way that you might hear, a theme in a movie, that when the bad guy comes in, Darth Vader's theme, and you go, oh, here he is, And so the Bible's actually written so that we use all the skills that we use when we're watching a good movie or reading a novel, or it's written for human beings, but it's written with the same sort of strategies and literary devices and visual tropes and all that sort of stuff. So academics don't think like that. They just see everything as something brand new, and it's isolated from everything else. And so often the jokes just go over their heads. One person who does get the references is Beale, but he doesn't think in sequences, as far as I can tell. He sort of misses that side of things. So he goes, right, this connects to this, and it's like playing a game of snap, where you have two cards that match, and you go, right, snap, and that's not enough. You have to go, okay, John 3:16 works through the 5 books of the Pentateuch, and that's part of Jesus' reference there. And you go, right, now I understand what he's saying to Nicodemus, because he's working through the sequence. And Revelation works through all the patterns that were established back in the books of Moses. And you can't, they're the key. The structure is the key. So unless you understand that it's recapitulating that pattern, which is repeated all through the Bible. It's not new when you get to Revelation. This is kind of like this, the final version of the snowball, like it's just now it's giant and it's picked up everything on the way down.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a British academic, I can't remember her name, but she said, Revelation is a pastiche. And she got that far. She realized that it's just grabbing a whole lot of stuff and kind of putting it together like a collage. And that's what it's doing. But you have to understand the sequence to get all the references. And the good thing is it's not that complicated a pattern. It starts in Genesis 1. So, yeah, I think that's the key. Yeah, it's getting the references. Yeah. What was the question again?
It was well, you gave us some background on yourself, and it was like how you got into Bible prophecy.
Yeah, well, that was James Jordan, and he's got a phrase he likes to use, which is he calls it the Bible's. We're getting into the deep weird now, so he likes the word weird. And but the thing is, once you get into it, I mean, he was always attracted to the difficult parts of the Bible and wanting to figure them out, which is fantastic. And he does a fantastic job. So when you get into it, it's not actually that weird. It's no different than what we see in a lot of other things. But yeah, so I heard his lectures and I thought, this needs a wider audience. So I wrote a book, which is about 800 pages long, which was like, someone needs to put what these guys have done all together in one book. And I did it, and it's still kind of, the thesis holds up, but it was a bit sloppy. This is 2008. And so then since then I've been, kind of working on it and refining it and systematizing it a bit. But, that's, and blogging and writing. So, that's my story. It's just one of those things. I'd always had questions like yourself. You think there's got to be some internal logic here that's governing this. God doesn't write nonsense. It's not babble. It's got to make sense. And it turns out it's so meticulously engineered that it's, as you would have read, it's a fractal. Like it's the same pattern working at multiple levels. And so you can make perfect sense of it. Yeah. So, and I'm still a graphic designer, that's, that pays the bills.
Yeah. Well, man, and that's wild because, when I picked up your material, and it must have been like a recommendation that came up when I was looking for, I don't even know. I think Amazon recommended your book, but I came across it.
Oh, okay. It wasn't someone saying, steer clear of this guy.
I have no idea. I think that's how I came across it. Either that or I looked up Matrix, and I don't think I did that. I think it came up as a suggestion. But it came up from some other author that anyway. But when I read your material, I thought, this guy is thinking differently. You're not shy how you've taken what James B. Jordan, Peter Leithart, and some of their interpretations, and you kind of take them to the next level. And you certainly, I think you've done that. So I appreciate that you, pay homage to, where your foundation lies, but I also appreciate that you're also bringing something unique to the table. A lot of authors just kind of like recycle material, and they're not really bring anything new to the table. It's almost like a lesser version of what the author did. But I feel like you did the opposite. You kind of again just brought more out as far as what the work they have already put in. So I noticed you said that you're also writing for Theopolis Institute as well. Which James B. Jordan, I guess that's Peter Leithart's thing. How did that come about?
Well, I asked Peter Leithart to write a foreword for my Bible Matrix book, which was a summary of that really big book. Yeah. And pestered him enough that he eventually said yes. He's a lovely guy. Like, he's just so gracious, and he's been very encouraging. I mean, he's a pedo-Baptist. I'm Baptistic. I wouldn't call myself a Baptist, but he's very what's the word? Ecumenical. I don't know, but he puts up with me being a Baptist, in that sense. But he does have a history of encouraging people who have got something to offer, regardless of their differences. and he's just very gracious, and he realizes that this is a group project. Insights are going to come from different people because that's how God works, and that theology over the centuries is, God didn't spell everything out from the start. We've got the basics, obviously, but this is how he matures us. We're supposed to figure things out, and meanwhile treat each other with respect and charity and whatever. But when he started the Theopolis blog, he invited me to write, which I was quite surprised about. And that was, I had to lift my game as far as the quality of my writing goes, which has been fun. And also too, I used to write basically it was like someone who drives, but they're not keeping the passenger in mind. I'd be sudden stops and starts. And for me, it was just a matter of getting ideas down on the page. I thought I really need to learn to write for the reader. And so my style is a sort of a mix of James Jordan, Peter Leithart, and probably Douglas Wilson, who's a bit controversial, but he's pretty edgy the way he writes and very funny as well. So it's a mix of those three because they're the ones who I've kind of read the most. Yep. But I probably write 2 or 3 times a year, and he's just been very encouraging. He's not that much older than me, maybe a decade, but I still think of him like my spiritual dad. These guys are my spiritual fathers as far as theology goes, but also with how they have a good sense of humor. They love looking at the tough bits of the Bible and trying to work things out. And they submit to the word. They don't judge the scriptures. They're like, if something doesn't make sense, the problem is with us, not with the Bible. And I mean, I had some years back in a fundamental Baptist church, and despite the fact that they were dispensational and not particularly academic, they honor the scriptures. And that's one thing I got from them as well, is that this is the word of God. And so when anyone has a bit of an arrogant attitude towards the Bible and says, well, it's a bit of a shambles here, or they didn't know what they were talking about there, and I don't respect I don't respect them. God, if you honor the scriptures and you submit to the Bible, then God will give you the insights. He will, there's times when I've prayed, look, please help me to understand this, and he's answered my prayer, So submission first, submission to God and to the word, and that's the only way you're going to learn, is to honor the word. So
wow, that's incredible, man. That's really, really encouraging to hear. And I know just from everything I read on that website, Theopolis Institute, I love it, and I love that Peter Leithart seems to have that approach of bringing people together. And I know he wrote a book basically just honoring James P. Jordan. So I mean, he has kind of this like, I'm not surprised to hear what you had to say, because it does seem like he is very charitable in that regard, and that's just really cool.
He's just quickly, he's kind of James B. Jordan's. The first time I listened to him, I read something by him, I was like, wow, this is so different. I'm really struggling to understand how he thinks. But once you get used to it, he teaches you how to read the Bible. But that's James Jordan's a bit hard for a lot of people to swallow straight off. So Peter Leithart seems to have made it his mission to be sort of the gateway drug, to like the mediator. He sort of, takes James Jordan and sort of makes it a bit more palatable, because he's, like sort of gets you, it's like, well, I'm going to explain things in a way that you're used to hearing, but I'll be gradually introducing you to the way Jordan thinks. And because, Jordan makes connections, and you think, how do you, and people, accuse me of, how did you get from there to there? And sometimes it's just, I'm familiar enough with how this is constructed that it's just intuition. and another friend of mine who's a Presbyterian, he's, been to college and everything and seminary. And he's like, I can see the connection now that you've pointed it out, but how did you get there? And it's like making a connection when you're watching a movie. There's that again, but yeah, that's what he's done. He's not watered it down, but sort of, presented it as a more palatable meal for people who are used to reading the regular sort of theology. And Peter Lightheart's a fantastic all-rounder. It doesn't matter anything. He covers all sorts of bases, so he's a perfect person to do that. Yeah. So that's been a good project, and I've seen it's working. There's a lot more people who have been exposed to it and are starting to think in those ways. I think there needs to be more guardrails. I think once people get into typology, they tend to make connections. That's one thing, that the structure that I've been looking at is the Bible has its own built-in guardrails.
Yeah.
The sequencing actually stops you from making connections that are not there, that might look plausible, but I call them drive-by typology. Like, this matches that, therefore there's a connection. But the way the Bible's structured actually has its own. There's sprockets on the film, and that sort of restrains the abuse of typology because it's got a bit of a bad name. So that's an important point to make.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a, yeah, it makes a lot of, sense you put it like that with, Peter trying to introduce people to James B. Jordan. But for me, like, I just did an episode on typology. I love typology. And to your point, that was something that came up in the episode. I mean, I know that people can take it and go to all kinds of crazy places. But, I mean, when I read James B. Jordan, these are connections that I have gotten better over the years in kind of making. But, I mean, you read that, and some of your writing is like, whoa. I mean, just like, it's just like mind-blowing, unbelievable, the connections. Anyway, so hopefully we can bring some of that out today in this episode before we get into
you should start on the questions you sent me.
yeah That's right.
That's fine.
We're easing our way in here. I don't know. So one thing that I feel like is a huge strength to the preterist view. I would actually think this is the biggest strength of the preterist view, is the connection that we see between the book of Revelation and the Gospels and even the epistles, because that's one big mystery. As far as someone that holds a future view, you see all this talk of this imminent return from Paul and Peter and John. And the question is, like, where was it? And then you go back in the Gospels and Jesus, like, man, and this can kind of go over your head. But if you really look at what he's saying, he's constantly talking about this judgment that's coming. That's relevant to that generation. It's imminent. It's like pressing. So anyway, talk about the connection between Revelation and the Gospels and the epistles.
Yeah, I think the main thing we need to understand is that the job of the prophet was basically God's repo man. Like, remember this contract you signed when you purchased the car and you're paying it off and you haven't been making the payments, and now I'm here and I'm knocking on your door and I'm coming to take your car or your television or whatever you bought, So the idea that when the prophets were sent, they referred back to the law of Moses, because that was what the people had broken. They'd broken the covenant. So any of the prophets, whether it's the major prophets, the minor prophets, and then when their job, or even Pharaoh and Egypt became rich because of Joseph's faithfulness to God, and God used Joseph to bless Egypt. But then, like Adam, Egypt took all of those blessings for granted, took them for granted. So Moses and Aaron come as God's prophets to repossess what Egypt had received from Joseph and Joseph's ministry. So they were like, okay, you've turned from God. We're here to take back the blessings that you received. And, that's so they're the repo men. So the plagues on Egypt were an act of repossession. And then, then God's like, well, the inheritance will be given to not to your son, but to my son, Israel. And that's when they go and they will conquer Canaan. But also, too, they plunder Egypt. So when we get to the New Testament, there's so many references to the prophets. And the ministry of Jesus and the apostles, not completely, but in a big way, was announcing this lawsuit against the rulers of Jerusalem. And that's why he talks about the law and the prophets as two legal witnesses. You had to have a minimum of two witnesses to condemn somebody, 2 or 3 witnesses. It's why Jesus said, if 2 or 3 are gathered together in a matter of church discipline, there am I among you. Like you've gathered, we've got enough witnesses here. And if you're, obviously walking in the Spirit and being merciful and just, then your judgment is my judgment. You are my legal representatives. So, Revelation is, you've got this lawsuit going on from the ministry of Jesus through the ministry of the apostles. Jesus forgave the people for, crucifying him. But then when some repented, some didn't. And the ones who didn't, especially the rulers, then started massacring the church, and they filled up their sins. In other words, their blood guilt got worse and worse, and to the point where God was then totally justified in condemning them because they had not repented. And it's like, as Paul says, they hardened their hearts like Pharaoh, and it was the actual words of the prophets that hardened their hearts. As with Pharaoh, it was the words of Moses that gradually hardened his heart. And so Revelation is it's the culmination of that lawsuit, where the witnesses have now condemned them. Sorry, those who were accused had now condemned themselves by murdering the Christians, the apostles especially. And Revelation is the execution, the pronouncement of the sentence. Jesus when he says no more delay. There had been a 1 generation delay. The generation where he was on the cross, and he could have had the city and the sanctuary destroyed then and there, as it says in Daniel. But I don't believe Daniel sees that delay. He sees the death of the Messiah and the destruction of the city and the sanctuary as being almost immediate. But as in the wilderness, there's a 40-year delay. And it's like, because, and as I think it's Peter who says, well, maybe it's Paul, quotes Isaiah saying, he didn't cut us off like Sodom and Gomorrah. He gave us another chance. And the old generation was going to be, was going to die in the wilderness. And that's what Hebrews says. Hebrews constantly referring to the wilderness years. So you've got this 40-year gap. And then basically the same thing with the crucifixion of Christ is repeated, but now it's the massacre of the first fruits church. And so you've got Jesus as the head and the church as the body of the sacrifice. And then the end comes. So Revelation it's like heaven's view of, and presented as a sacrificial liturgy of the destruction of Jerusalem. But going back to what we were talking about before, there are preterists who see Revelation as being all about the Jewish war. What I noticed with James Jordan, which is a major difference, is he sees Revelation as describing the spiritual war of the apostles against the Jewish rulers. So that actually changes how you interpret all of the details in the center of the book. It's not, the Jewish war doesn't come in until the judgment towards the end of the book of the great city. So it's a spiritual war. And of course, when you then go back and look at, Ephesians and the spiritual armor, and, Jesus saying to Peter, feed my sheep, and then you're going to be martyred. And then you realize that he's asking Peter to feed his sheep so that they can go to slaughter. Yeah. Like this is big stuff, But I think, so what you're saying is Revelation is so intimately integrated with the rest of the New Testament as the culmination of the ministry. And what it does is it gets the old order of animal sacrifices and the temple. It brings an end to the old era completely. And that's why Jesus said the blood of Abel will be finally avenged, along with all the prophets. That entire era of substitutionary sacrifices was coming to an end. And Revelation shows that God now was accepting human sacrifices, not to atone for sin, but the martyrs were a testimony that as a foundation of the new era where God accepts us in Christ rather than through animal sacrifices. So that's why it's such a Jewish book. You know, there's as Beale picks up, you know, there's he does make these connections.
Yep.
But yeah, the reason is it was all fulfilled by AD 70. It does give us a glimpse of this current age at the end of the book. But it's the two witnesses in Revelation are Moses and Elijah. It's the law and the prophets, but it's their testimony in the mouths of the apostles. So once again, it's a reference to the law. So at the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah are there as the law and the prophets. The law is don't do this, and the prophet is look what you did. Right? You know, I mean our parents do that. You know, it's just so there's the second witness. And so when the father says this is my beloved son, but then when he says hear him, he's actually giving the authority of Moses and Elijah to Jesus. And that's why Revelation talks about the testimony of Jesus. He's got all of their power. And then all of the curses of the law, after a generation of threshing and gradually converting a lot of Jews and Gentiles as well. And then Jesus said, you know, leave when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, leave. So basically the only people that were left when Titus surrounded the city during Passover were those who had rejected the testimony of Christ and the testimony of Paul. They gathered from afar off across the empire into the city, and they were trapped. And, you know, their table became a snare. Passover became a trap. And, you know, then you get into Josephus and read what happened.
Yeah.
But to understand it, it's Moses is the key to Revelation. And if once we understand that, I think most people do know they're familiar enough with the books of Moses and with the Old Testament. But when you're told this is the connection you have to make, all of a sudden it starts to make sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. When I first saw the title and cover of the book with Moses, I thought, I've never heard this before. What is this all about? So it definitely piqued my interest.
That worked then. Good.
It totally did. I love the cover.
I do some marketing as well, you know, so I do tend to try and, you know, provoke a bit. Yeah,
it did. I mean, I've just I've never heard it from that angle, so it worked for me at least. It's just such an incredible way to read the book of Revelation. And I've always said, you know, the reason why I was so attracted to the preterist views because it just seems naturally that this would be the most natural way to read it. It was written, we have even the 7 local churches right there. It's written to a certain set of people at a certain time. They were supposed to soon take place. I mean, those are all like huge strengths that I think the preterist view has. I just don't like the whole, I've got, you know, Jewish Wars by Philetus Josephus in one hand and the book of Revelation in the other. And I'm just here like, you know, making connections like that. That's the only way I've heard it explain it to me. And that's what I just like, no. But anyway, so we're going to get into it. You already mentioned John 3:16 taking a pattern through the Pentateuch. And so for anyone that's familiar with chiasms, you really take that to like a whole new level, and you're able to take, once you kind of study chiasms, when I first kind of started to get into it, it's like, okay, I see this, okay, I see that, but you don't realize just how much it really is just a pattern for how the entire, it's really honestly apologetic for the inerrancy of Scripture, seeing, because when you take a look at all these different authors over time, and they're writing in the same structure. It's pretty incredible to think, wow. And James B. Jordan was one of those that pointed out that a lot of these books are actually penned. They're actually, like, the authors are just scribes. They're just told to write down what they saw or what was said to them. I never really realized that. But for anyone that's not familiar with what a chiasm is, because I know your Bible Matrix book really lays that out, and that's kind of the beginning of how you lay out Revelation as having a chiastic structure. Can you walk us through the shape of Revelation and this, how it fits with the Bible Matrix and it has a chiastic structure?
I think the first thing, if someone doesn't know what a chiasm is, it's basically that the text has a symmetrical shape. So, and a lot of it seems to be some of these devices are being used more and more by modern movie writers, where where it starts is where it ends. Like or it's like in The Hobbit, it's a there and back again. Or your day at work, where you leave home, you go to work, and you come back again. So it's this symmetrical shape, and if it's got 7 steps, it'll be A, B, C, D, C, B, A. But there's a progression as well. So just like when you go to work and you come back again, you're not the same person. You've earned some money, you've learned some things, you've changed the world in some way. And as in any story, it's like the hero's journey in that sense. I think the most chiasms that people pick up are merely symmetry. There's various authors who've done it over the years, like with the Noah narrative, which works its way towards a center point where it says, "And God remembered Noah," and then the rest of the story basically reverses everything that's happened previously in some way. Yeah. And when you see it laid out, you say, "Oh, okay, that's how this is structured." And the difference with this method in ancient literature is that the point of the story is in the middle, not at the end. And if you can identify the center, which is not that difficult, then you know what the author's point is, and the fact that in this point it was God remembered Noah. The difference with the Bible Matrix stuff is it's not just about symmetry, where you're just matching the mirrored points of each step to kind of make sense of the symmetry. What I call these quantum chiasms, because they're entangled, like when you see that Jesus works through the books of Moses in John 3:16, for God so loved the world, Genesis, he gave his son, Passover, Exodus, whoever believes in him, Leviticus is about being a living sacrifice, will not perish, the judgment of Israel in the book of Numbers, but have everlasting life, and the promises in Deuteronomy. And so he's saying, I've come to fulfill the law. And I'm taking it to the next level, This is now not just the inheritance of Canaan. This is now eternal life. And because the Jews memorized scripture, their whole year with their feasts was the same pattern. They had this built in, so they got the references. But the quantum chiasm means that in this case, we see John 3:16 is kind of quantum entangled with the Pentateuch. And they're interpreting each other. And you see the same pattern in Genesis chapters 1 to 5, which is the legal structure of God's covenants. But what it means is that every part of the Bible is using some version of the same structure, which means they're all talking to each other at once, like the number of connections you can make. And as we're talking about Revelation actually works through the 7-fold pattern. And it's recapitulating the first 7 books of the Bible, which take us to the conquest of Canaan. But this is a spiritual conquest. And so it starts with the vision of Jesus, who is Adam in the Garden of Eden. And he's surrounded by these lampstands, and the lampstands were made to look like trees. Mm-hmm. So he's the high priest who's trimming the wicks on the lamps to make them shine brighter as he purifies the pastors of these churches and gets them as his representatives to discipline and to encourage the churches. And then Exodus is the burning bush, and that's when we actually have the letters to the 7 churches, which are a Gentile menorah, which is another joke. That's absolutely shocking, really. Mm-hmm. Leviticus is the ascension of Christ as the Lamb, and that's where we see Christ ascend to heaven, and he's the the whole world's about to come to an end, but then he opens the scroll, which is the new covenant, and the blessings and the curses come out to deal with the old order. And that leads to Numbers, which is kind of the wilderness time for the church, and there's spiritual war that's going on. Then we have Deuteronomy, which is the repeating the law to a new generation. And here we have the trumpets, which is a battle between the true church and the false church, described in Old Testament imagery. So it's a spiritual war where the imagery is talking about ancient physical battles, but it's and there's lots of jokes, and it's basically Jacob versus Esau, because it's the church versus the Herods, who were descended from Esau, and it's like they're struggling in the womb to see who's going to be the firstborn, who's going to get the inheritance. That's what it's about. So there's lots of Jacob and Esau jokes there, mentions. And then you have Joshua, and you have the great city and the harlot, but it's not faithful Rahab. It's, the false religion, the temple that's now drinking the blood of the saints, and that's a reference to Numbers 5 with the woman with the cup. But this is the Joshua step. So there's lots of Jericho imagery. And then finally you have the book of Judges, and that's why you see the saints now enthroned, and they have authority to judge between good and evil, which was always the point with Adam and Eve. So it's actually describing the time from the ascension of Christ through the apostolic witness up until the judgment of Jerusalem, and then with a glimpse of this current age at the end. And it follows the basic legal structure of God's covenants as well. So once you see that the book of Hebrews makes all the same connections. And so, if you read Hebrews and then come to Revelation and go, okay, now we're actually seeing this in action. But it's described in terms of the operations of the temple. I mean, it works, that sevenfold pattern also works through Israel's annual feasts, and the judgment of the city aligns with the Day of Atonement. So instead of 7 sprinklings of blood, you have the blood of the animals now being rejected and tipped out in judgment in 7 bowls.
Wow.
So it's the Old Testament religion being rejected now because Christ has made it obsolete. It was ready to vanish away, and now we're shown it actually being destroyed. And that's so the point of the book is it's the end of the law. It's the end of the circumcision and the law. These things were made legally redundant at the cross, and now they're being physically removed. So it removes that the wall of partition that Paul talks about. It's actually finally being demolished. But then you start to make sense of all the details. But there's some fantastic stuff in there that's so subtle and so funny in some, like the comedy roast. Like, it's like a political cartoon where it's so funny, but it's so cutting. And I'm working through Isaiah at the moment. He uses all the same sort of devices and structures, and the prophets ridicule those who should know better. There's a place for ridicule, but you ridicule those who know better and are not doing what God said. And so they make these terrifying jokes, So Revelation is actually pretty funny. One thing I will point out just to illustrate that is Revelation starts with the 7 churches who comprise a Gentile lampstand, the menorah in the tabernacle. And in the book of Daniel, you have the lampstand shining the light on the wall, and that's the light by which Belshazzar sees the handwriting condemning him as a lightweight. You've been weighed in the balances, and it's you're not glorious and heavy like gold. You're just a bunch of chaff, basically. You're a lightweight. That's why you're ruling with a heavy hand. But in Revelation, you've got this Gentile lampstand, and then you have Babylon, which is Jerusalem. So it's reversed. You've now got a Gentile lampstand shining the light, and the rest of the book is the writing on the wall for a Jewish spiritual Babylon, also Egypt and Sodom. Wow. And that's the joke. Like, it's
wild.
Yeah, it's a bit like, Elisha healed the spring that was causing miscarriages in Jericho. I mean, Jericho is the city where all flesh was cut off under Joshua. And then he goes, and then the children of Bethel, where one of the golden calves was situated, are ridiculing God's prophet, and he sets the bears on them.
Yeah.
So he's basically rendering Israel barren while the believing Gentiles are made fruitful. And there's this reversal. So the irony is, it's pretty full on. But you've got to have it's a pity that more Jews don't read the New Testament. They would get the jokes.
Yeah.
There's a few that do. Yeah.
Yeah. That's wild. Awesome. So I think I want to probably start getting into more of like the nitty gritty details and kind of work our way through the book. But I'll start at the 24 elders. That was something that was honestly shocking when I read it. But I had heard similar things. So it was something I sort of grasped onto. But can you tell us who the 24 elders are? And then what's the connection between those and the elders and the angels that told the disciples after Christ's ascension? Sorry, what the angels.
I can't remember what I wrote, and I might have actually changed my mind since I wrote that. So you tell me, and then I'll respond. Because I think Jordan's position is that Jordan says that they are angels. But and that they were, because the saints were now that Christ had ascended to heaven, people could ascend to heaven, and the angels were basically casting down their crowns as they left one by one. And their various judgments take place through the book, and then at the end the saints come in and take on the offices that the angels as servants had. It's now being given to sons. That could still be true, but it seems to me that the Bible you never see a crowned angel, because angels are servants, and only sons wear crowns. Like, there's this whole thing between servants and sons. Even Christ became a servant that then he might be glorified as a son. Paul says that when they're children, you can't tell a difference between the servant's children and the heirs of the household. But as they mature, the inheritance is for the sons. So, look, they're angels in the sense that they're still acting as servants. I tend to think now that they were actually possibly the covenant heads of the old covenant, like people like Enoch, who was taken, some of these other, Elijah. I'm not sure, but the idea is, in a sense, they're holy warriors. Jordan does make the connection that when a Nazirite who didn't cut his or her hair, could be male or female, when they finished their vow of holy war, they would cut off their hair, as Paul did. He took the vow for his spiritual warfare, and then they would offer it. And I think it would be burnt up. I think that's what they did. So the idea of them casting their crowns was giving their glory to God. So in some sense, these are holy warriors, which they could just be angels who were taking that role until mankind was matured and ready, and Christ had opened the door for them to enter God's court in heaven. But I'm starting to think that they were actually a lot of the sort of the priest-king type roles from the Old Testament, like sort of God just plucking the best ones, like Job and some of the others who were the heads of each age. So it could be either, but the point that their job was now done, and that they were giving their legacy now to the martyrs and the apostles and the saints, because the way was now open. That stands. That's the idea that, well, our job is now done. Our war is over. We are offering up our glorious hair, our crown, and to God, because our battle is finished. And now it's being given to the new generation. And the way the Bible works in harvest cycles, which is the same chiastic pattern, is that each cycle leaves a legacy for the next one to pick up and take on, like a baton in a race. But each cycle expands God's territory and the maturity of mankind to discern between good and evil. We still see that now, where, we had the challenge of Marxism as a counterfeit Christianity. Yes, we'll give you heaven on earth but give us control, which is the lie in the Garden of Eden, Mm-hmm. And now we have neo-Marxism, which people say, well, this isn't Marxism. It's like, yeah, it's a new spin because God wants us to discern. Here's the latest lie from the devil. You're going to have to think. You're going to have to take what God said in the past, but apply it in a new situation. And he's not going to spell it out for you. He didn't do that for Adam. He didn't do it for anybody. It's like, take what I said, but you're going to have to use your brain. You're going to have to believe what I said, but then also do some thinking and develop some wisdom to discern between good and evil, because evil often looks like good and good often looks like evil. Mm-hmm. If God says, you're going to have to die, or at least, deny yourself, that seems bad. But Jesus looked beyond that sacrifice to the glory that was set before him. And that's what we have to do. We have to see that, there's a time of humiliation and humbling, and then the glory comes, whereas Satan says, hey, I have the glory. I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. Jesus is like, I'll have them, but not from you, know. And I think then Satan went and offered it to the Herods, and they said, yes, which it seems that they did. So I think this pattern, that was these elders were, that their time was done. The last step of the covenant pattern is about covenant succession, making arrangements for the next generation. You see that in all the Old Testament stories where it'll end with a genealogy or with talking about the person's children or whatever. Paul does the same thing in the New Testament with his epistles, but he ends with greetings to the saints. It's not to physical children. He's talking to sons of God. So the emphasis has shifted from physical offspring to spiritual offspring, like Paul and Timothy, who were father and son in spiritual sense. So the 24 elders, they could just be angels. The angels of the churches were actually pastors, which is an indication that, we're if you have the word angel, but you put EV on the beginning, evangel, like where the ministry is now being passed on to God's sons. You actually see that in Exodus, where it's an angel that's bearing the sword against Egypt at the Passover. But when you get to Jericho, who's bearing the sword? It's not angels from heaven. It's God's people. The sword is now in the hand of Joshua. And God's people are the angels now. So it's the same thing about using angels at the start and then preparing human beings for the role and then giving them the sword. And that's what Adam was supposed to do. God cut Adam's flesh, but then Adam was supposed to crush the serpent, and then God would have given him the flaming sword. All right, now you're in charge. You're the Joshua in a sense. You're going to enter the land from the garden, and you're going to subdue the world. But he blew it. So the sword, he was still under the sword. So, that's the pattern. So I think the legacy idea is still there, but I just don't see angels wearing crowns. I think these guys were sort of the preliminary. They were God's court in heaven, and they were human, but it doesn't say so. We just have to, do our best. Yeah, but the point is that their job was done. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, either way, it still works as there's the changing of the guard. And I had heard an argument for why the elders had to be human as well. So seeing the connection between the elders mentioned earlier in the book in chapters either 4 and 5, and then in chapter 20, I thought, oh, okay, I can see how we have the the new covenant now is consummated, and we have the sort of changing of the guard. I thought that was really beautiful.
Just quickly, it's a bit like Solomon, where it goes into great detail to talk about the beginning of his reign, but then he installs a new government. You know, like he deals with all of his father's enemies and either has them killed or exiled, which is what's happening in Revelation with the Jewish rulers. And then we see the new broom, you know. The new government. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's crazy. Okay, the 144,000, who are they?
Do you want their names? I think the reference, the reason that they're listed, you know, tribe by tribe, it's a reference to Numbers 7, where you have each of the tribes bringing their offerings to the tabernacle, you know, lots of vessels and basins and whatever, and it lists it all and it's so repetitious. But the whole point is it's architecture and it's listing them out. But the difference with this, and this begins the sort of the Numbers section of the book, or at least leads up to it, is that these Jewish saints are the first fruits to God and the Lamb, and they are now the vessels. You know, we're not bringing replicas of human. We're not bringing substitutes for human beings like animals and vessels and all sorts of stuff in the tabernacle. The furniture in the tabernacle all represented people. You know, the table was the priest, the lampstand was the king, the incense altar was the prophet, and because people could not serve in God's presence in that way. So these things were like promises. Here's the offices that you're going to inherit, represented as furniture. But now in Revelation, we actually have that furniture being fulfilled. And that's why it starts with Jesus being described as a human tabernacle. You know, he's got the lampstand in his right hand, 7 stars. So that, you know, all these things that were architecture is being fulfilled in human society. It's always the architecture is the blueprint. Now I'm going to measure that out in people, and that's why the New Jerusalem it's not a physical city. It's a city made of people. But this is the architectural blueprint. This is what it represents to God as architecture. So the 144,000, Jesus he's broken the seals on the scroll, and only he was worthy to do that, to open it. And so just as Moses ascended and received the tablets, which is like the law, you know, our hearts are made of stone, so we get these stony tablets and it has to be engraved in us. Jesus' scroll is, I'm assuming it's vellum, and vellum was made from lamb skin, and you couldn't use it if it had spots, all right, because then it would obscure what was written on it. You could misinterpret it, whatever. So Jesus himself was the lamb without spot. He was without blemish. The Levite priests could not be physically imperfect in any way. That's why Jesus said, well, if your heart's not right with God, what good is your physical perfection? Pluck out an eye, cut off a hand, cut off a leg. You know, like it's better that you be physically imperfect and have your heart perfect with God. So it's all referring to the law. You know, he's not that was the joke. It's not like, yeah, go and do this. It's like you're concerned with the pictures and not with the reality. So here he opens a scroll, which is it's the new covenant equivalent of the tablets of the law, but now it's the law written on flesh. And so he opens this scroll, breaks the seals, but then after that happens, 144,000 are sealed. And what it does is that turns each of them into little books. They are now little versions of this new covenant message. And what happens, why do you seal a scroll? You do it so that no one's going to basically read it until it gets to its destination. It's a protection. It's like the seal on Christ's tomb. You know, you put a wax seal so that they know if anybody's read it. And so these saints were sealed, and when the seal was broken was when their message reached its destination. When the seal was broken, they were killed. Their message, as the Greek word for martyr and witness is the same. You know, it's martyroi. They were the martyrs, but it means a witness. So basically in their deaths, they were proclaiming the word, and their seals were broken as they died. So,
wow.
but so basically the Lamb has ascended to heaven, and these 144,000, as it says in Leviticus, the ascension offering, choose a son of the herd, the best of the flock. Job was chosen from among the other priest kings, not angels. We'll get into that another time, I guess. But he was there with all the other guys who offered sacrifices, and God chose him as the one who was blameless and perfect. So, and it's like Jesus at his baptism. All these people came for baptism, and the Father selected the one without blemish. This is my son, the son of the herd. He's the one that was promised, and he's without blemish. And now I choose him for sacrifice, and he goes into the wilderness. And so these 144,000, Jesus is the head. He's ascended. They always offer the head of the sacrifice first in Leviticus 1 of the ascension offering. And then they would wash the body, the legs, etc., would be washed, and then that would be offered. So head and body. So these 144,000 are the body. Makes me cry just thinking about it, So, but it was prefigured in the book of Numbers where they were supposed to be the pure body. Moses is the head. They'd been baptized into Moses as the head without blemish. And now they were making their offerings, but then of course they blew it. They were tested, and hence the references to Balaam and the false prophet. The temptation for the church was to go back to the old way. And so this false prophet was like, the Israel was tempted with idolatry and spirit and physical adultery. But of course, then the great harlot is Jerusalem herself. The Pharisees condemned the tax collectors and the prostitutes, but Jerusalem was the biggest tax collector and the biggest prostitute, and in a collective sense. So there's the hypocrisy. So these were the Jewish believers who were, in Hebrews it says, you're being blackmailed to go back to the old order. When Peter said, baptism now saves you, baptism now delivers you, these saints were being blackmailed to go back to Judaism because they weren't allowed to keep the Jewish rites. They were banned from the temple. And he's saying, well, your baptism replaces that. You're no longer beholden to them. And also the judgment's coming on Jerusalem like a flood. You'll be like Noah, delivered from the old order entirely. So in a sense, the fact that they have expelled you is a blessing for you. And then I get in a bit of trouble for this one. When he talks about the spirits in prison, he's referring to the bit in where Jesus talks to those saints who have been slain and their blood, they're under the altar, like blood splashed on the sides of the altar. And he says, they're like, when are you going to avenge us? And he says, just a little longer, just one more generation. And until these New Testament saints are massacred as well as a second witness against these persecutors. And I think Peter says, but what's it later he talks to Jesus preaching to the dead, I think, is it? Anyway, there's another reference to it. But Peter's referring to Revelation and to Jesus telling these martyrs, and they're like John the Baptist in prison because they're questioning him. John is like, are you the one? Like, what's holding you back? Why are we still waiting? Why am I in prison?
Right. Yeah.
And so these saints are there and they're being told it's coming. Just hold on a little bit. Here's your white robe, which corresponds to baptism and investiture. Here's your white robe. And then later you see them on the crystal sea and they've been, you've got the Old Testament martyrs and the New Testament martyrs who are the 144,000 first fruits to God and the Lamb. And that helps to fulfill the law because now the head has been offered and the body has been offered.
Goodness.
And that's, So that's it. It's Leviticus. It's Levitical. Jordan points out too that for Passover, you could have a sheep or a goat. It could be a lamb or a kid. You could have a smooth Jacob or a hairy Esau. It didn't matter which one it was because they're both sons of Jacob. But the first fruits had to be a lamb. And so in Revelation, people point out that the ascension of the Lamb is Passover. No, it's not Passover. It's first fruits. Christ is the first fruits. But then the 144,000 become the kind of corporate first fruits. You know, you plant one seed, you get a harvest. Well, he died, ascended to heaven, and now there's this huge harvest of, and that's when you see Jesus with a sickle harvesting them later on.
That's so wild.
Like it's, yeah, well, that's it. You know, people think Jesus, the angel with the sickle, is killing the bad guys, and Jordan's he's like, no, this is grain and grapes. Like he's harvesting them as bread and wine.
Yeah.
Like their flesh and blood is just being offered, you know.
Man.
I mean, and so when you partake of the Lord's Supper, you become a human lamb. It's not like the Lord's Supper is not like Passover. It takes it to the next level. When, you know, Jesus, they had the Passover meal as Passover, and then when he took the bread and wine, this was like first fruits, and he's like, okay, now you guys are the lambs. You know, Peter, feed my sheep with the word. And then the harvest of that is the 144,000.
It's crazy. That's wild. That is so wild. That's wild. But I mean, man, when you hear that, it's hard not to see it. I mean, if you're familiar, like I said earlier with the Old Testament, it's like, wow, that's it.
But the thing is, because it happened then, and we see it happen in the first century, we realize that Jesus conquered the powers in his death and rose again. The massacre of those saints in the first century is what led to the destruction of their persecutors in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And they were the Jews are they're the bad guys in the first century. Those particular Jews, not Jews in general, those guys. A lot of the Jews believed these were the ones who were, you know, it was cancel culture, trying to cancel the church. That's what Matthew 25 sheep and goats judgment's about. You know, those who followed, those who believed in Jesus and followed Jacob, the sheep, and those who followed the Herods, who are from Esau, and they're the hairy goats. Okay, so this was like a Passover, and it's like, okay, I'm going to separate those of you who helped my disciples, the least of my brethren, and gave them supplies and hospitality and whatever. And here's you guys who were practicing first century cancel culture by denying them any support and trying to get rid of them. And you guys are going to be cut out of history. And the same thing happens in the exile, you know, where you had all of Israel's enemies, like, you know, the Philistines and all the other little kingdoms around the place. And the Babylonian flood wiped them all out. Like a flood, but only Israel rose again as the land, and all of those other kingdoms were disempowered. Okay, so you had the same thing where they were cut out of history. They were still around as individuals.
Sure.
You know, you had them taunting Nehemiah and others when they were trying to rebuild, but their kingdoms were gone. They were finished. So you have the same thing in the first century where this Roman the Jewish war basically kind of wiped out all of these old powers, including the Herods, but only the church would rise again as the new, and that, you know, they would go on. But the point I was going to make there was that the massacre of those saints led to the end of their persecutors, but that was just the next shockwave. And then you have the conquest of Rome, and it just keeps it's like a shockwave or sound waves from the cross. And so when people talk about post-millennialism as being triumphalistic, and that's the temptation, and Jordan points out, he talks about post-millennial suffering, where Jesus conquered in his death. Those first fruit saints, the 144,000, conquered in their deaths and overcame, and then God judged their persecutors. And then it just keeps going. So wherever the world is being conquered by suffering, and testimony, not just it's ups and downs. You know, we have times where the church is humbled and persecuted, and then God gives us authority, and then we get a bit corrupt and a bit complacent, and God humbles us again. And so the world is being Christianized like growth rings, and it's ups and downs, and that's the pattern. So when we read Revelation, it doesn't become irrelevant by all being mostly, at least in the first century. It actually makes it more relevant. It gives us the key to how the gospel conquers the world. So that was the next level. But also, too, you've got to remember that the Herods and Jerusalem, they were like the eggshell. And this was the new chick breaking out of the eggshell, and that like the old system had to go.
Yeah,
it was holding it back. They were trying to. Imagine, like you're in control of the temple. You've got a hold on everybody. You're making money on the sacrifices, and then there's people saying, "Oh no, those are now obsolete. We have Jesus' sacrifice. What are you going to do?" Like, you want to stay in business. You say we've got to get rid of this guy. Yeah. He's taking our trade from us.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's an extended explanation of the 144,000, but they were the next harvest. Yeah.
No, I love that explanation. I love that because it really you didn't give us the simple answer. You put it in context. In really and truly, if this is true, this puts such a bow on the end of the New Testament. And if this, without this interpretation, there's so much that's absent that seemed to be very, very important to Jesus and his ministry. And we don't ever see any of that addressed. If this is something that's in the future, where is all this that Jesus was talking about that seemed to be so important to his ministry, and even a lot of the epistles as well? So, that's why I love this interpretation so much. I like how James B. Jordan said is really is the vindication of Jesus Christ. We see it in this book. It's like, there it is. Wow. Anyway.
Yeah. But also on vindication, he said he would rise from the dead, and he was vindicated. And he said that the city would be destroyed. And this is the next layer of vindication. And so where I deal with full preterists who say, "Oh no, it's all finished now. The Bible's completely fulfilled. There's no final judgment," they take it to the extreme. But my point is that Jesus' first vindication was a garden vindication. He was in a garden tomb. Yeah. And that's Adam in the garden. And then his next vindication was against Cain, who killed Abel. That's why Jesus said the blood of Abel is going to be avenged. This is the murderous brother in the land, and that was the Herods, who were from Esau. And so what remains now? Garden, land, world. Yeah. The same pattern is found everywhere. Jesus was arrested and taken to the high priest, garden, Holy of Holies. Then he was sent off to Herod, land. Then he was hauled before Pilate, Rome, world. The same pattern. Paul goes through the same process. So the point is that Revelation does describe the final judgment at the end. It begins in a garden with Jesus amongst the trees, and then the bulk of the book is about the conquest of the land. And then we have a glimpse of the final judgment and the end and the final resurrection of the world. And that's the tabernacle. You had the most holy place as the garden, the holy place is the land, and the court of the Gentiles is the world. So our current era of history is the conquest of the court of the Gentiles, and then there'll be a judgment at the end of that. So it's this, like I said, it's this gradual expansion of Jesus' claimed territory and conquest of it through the suffering and testimony of the saints.
Wow, that's awesome. So I think you'll only be able to just kind of give us a big picture overview, which is why I'm kind of asking you to give us the seals, trumpets, and bowls in one question. We don't have the time to go through each, but can you give just like an overview of seals, trumpets, and bowls, just from 50,000 feet up?
Yeah. Well, it's working through the feasts, opening the central feast in Leviticus 23. It lists 7 feasts. The first one is the Sabbath, and that's a weekly feast, and that's like Adam in the creation week. But that sets the pattern for the whole thing. So once again, you've got like a head and a body. You've got 7 days, but then you've got this sevenfold pattern through the year, obviously divided into spring and autumn, but it's still 7. And the central one is Pentecost, and that's the harvest festival. And so the seals where it's also God gave the law to Israel at the first Pentecost, and God gave the Spirit to Israel at the last Pentecost. So they're bookends. Okay. The law is external. It's words coming to us like parents telling their kids what to do. The last Pentecost is the law has now been internalized. We have the law of the Spirit. And so what was then external coming to us to change us is now internal, and now we're mature. We are now self-governing because we've submitted to God. It's adulthood in that sense, where okay, now you've it's kind of like Adam. God came to the garden, returned. It's not in the cool of the day; it's the wind of the day. This was to be Adam's Pentecost, a mighty rushing wind. Where are you? Whereas the saints at Pentecost in Acts were waiting for God. Adam was hiding. So he missed out on his Pentecost. He didn't get the Holy Spirit, He was supposed to have obeyed God and waited, and then he would have received the Spirit and then would have been God's prophet. But we never hear from him ever again. Like, no words are recorded. So in Revelation, the seals correspond to so you've got the Lamb ascends as first fruits, and then you have the seals, which correspond to the day of Pentecost. And in the tabernacle, that corresponds to the 7 lights on the lampstand. So the tongues of fire on the day of Pentecost, where they're human lampstands. So the 7 seals are basically the legal declaration of what's coming. And the horsemen are the gospel. In a sense, you could say they end up being the 4 gospels, where the first one is light. The white horse brings the message. Then that divides the people, where Jesus said, father versus son, mother versus daughter, etc. That causes division between the natural people who are still natural and those who are converted and who have the Spirit. Then you have the old order, like bread being starved away and becoming like a famine. And then the oil and the wine are the new covenant. And those are things that are kingly, and that's not harmed. So it's basically saying that like John said, I must decrease, he must increase. The old covenant was wasting away. Zechariah describes it as people's eyes and tongues, which is, the vision and the prophecy of the old covenant is corrupt. Herod himself has become like old manna filled with maggots because you kept it for too long. So he's eaten with worms. He's not the bread of life; he's the bread of death.
Yeah.
So that's the seals. The like Moses bringing the tablets, and of course the joke is when Moses went up the mountain, they said, "Where is he?" Well, Aaron, make a golden calf. Well, here Jesus has gone up to heaven, and they're like, "Well, where's he gone?" Oh, we'll just keep building the temple. So the image of the beast is the temple. It's the golden calf for the high priest. And they just kept building this big fancy building, which was glorious. And then of course Jesus is going to come back like Moses did, and hear all these celebrations where they killed millions of lambs. They had these humongous Passovers from I think 64 to 66, and that's when Jesus, like Moses, comes back and basically, grinds it to powder.
Yeah.
So that's Pentecost. So the seals are, I think the final seal is described as Jesus pouring out fire from heaven, and there's blood and whatever else. But the idea is that's actually the sending of the Spirit. So the final seal is the day of Pentecost.
Wow.
And that's when Peter said there'll be blood and fire and smoke. That's a sacrifice. There's blood, you cut the animal, you put it on the altar, and then you apply the fire, and then there's smoke, and then God smells the sacrifice, and then he either rejects it or accepts it. And so the idea that Israel itself was now being put on the altar, was being cut in half by the gospel, like Abraham's sacrifices, put on the altar.
Yeah. The
Holy Spirit falls as fire, and then the smoke, as Paul says, our testimony is a stench to some. It smells like death to some, but it smells like life to others. And so the Israel on the altar for the sake of the nations is a sacrifice. The smoke was the testimony of the apostolic church. And that brings us to the trumpets, which corresponds. So we had the fire at Pentecost. The trumpets is smoke, and it's the idea of, the trumpets is breath. It's a wind instrument. The creation of Adam works through the same thing, where God gives him the breath, and then the breath of life, and he becomes a living creature. Works through the same pattern. Adam becomes a living creature through this liturgical tabernacle pattern. But the Feast of Trumpets is the next one, and that's, people say, oh, no, the trumpets, Pentecost happened in the first century, but the trumpets are yet future. It's like, no, the trumpets are the testimony of the apostles. But then in Revelation, you have the trumpets as the testimony of the true church. And then in Revelation 13, you have the response of the false church, and you have the land beast and the sea beast, which is the Jews and the Romans together against the church, against the Jew-Gentile church. So now it's not Jews versus Gentiles, it's bad Jews and Gentiles versus good Jews and Gentiles. And that's when you have their false worship. They call down fire from heaven like the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, which is quite an insult. You know, they're cutting themselves like the priests of Baal, but in this case, if they're circumcising themselves, Paul says you might as well become eunuchs for all the good it's going to do you, and that would actually render you unfit for service under the law. You know, go the whole way, really. You know, so there's good trumpets and bad trumpets. There's these two. There's a true testimony and a false testimony, and they don't corroborate. That's the point. You know, this is the Deuteronomy, the fifth feast, the fifth book, the Deuteronomy step. There's supposed to be 2 or 3 witnesses. You have the true testimony of the church, and it's 2 witnesses. Then you have a false testimony, like those who accused Jesus and said he said this and he said that and whatever. But the thing is that Judaism at that point had become demonized. It's like Jesus said, I've come and swept the house, but it'll be filled with 7 worse demons. And the worst demons are like the 7 lights of a bad lampstand. You know, the eye is the light of the body. The lampstand was like the 7 eyes of God, 7 spirits. But here, their eyes are filled with darkness. And it's like a false Pentecost, where we're claiming that we have divine unction, God's divine blessing upon us. And like Paul thought he was doing the work of God by killing the Christians. That's what they were doing. But by this point, the other correspondence here is God sending an evil spirit to Saul after he gave the spirit to David. And Saul persecuted David. And so here you've got the old order persecuting the new order. Yeah. But God uses the old order to train the new order and humble the saints so that they were ready to take the throne. So we have to suffer in some sense to humble us, that we can take the throne from God without stealing it from him. As was what Jesus did. He didn't grasp equality with God. He was made complete or perfect through suffering. So, you know, and David he would never take the throne by his own hand, even from his own son. He would only have it from God. So that's the trumpets is the true and the false churches in their testimony, in a sense, in God's court. And then the bowls, the structure where the angels come out of the heavenly sanctuary with the bowls, it actually works through the tabernacle pattern. And it makes it, if you look at that, where the bowls are mentioned corresponds to the lampstand. So the bowls actually come from the top of the branches of the lampstand. So because the unbelieving Jews had rejected the lampstand tongues of fire on the day of Pentecost, they'd rejected the Holy Spirit. As the angels come through, they take the bowls from the top of the lampstand in heaven, and those are poured out in judgment. But the lampstand pictured the light of the law. So now that light was coming to them as a consuming fire.
Goodness. Okay.
And of course, where do we first see the lampstand in Revelation? We see it in the testimony of the 7 churches. So they were prepared as bowls of judgment at the start And it's their testimony that is later poured out upon Jerusalem in judgment. But their testimony has now got the added gravitas of the fact that they've been murdered. Like the violence was centered in Jerusalem, but it spread right across the empire. And of course, when Rome got involved and started blaming the Christians for Nero blamed the Christians. Mm-hmm. That's when the beast comes up, the sea beast comes up out of the sea. So you can imagine the Christians thinking, well, Jesus might have been a false prophet. We've now got the Jews and the Gentiles against us. The whole world is against us. That's when they started. That's the falling away. But those who persevered, as Jesus said, those who persevere to the end will be saved or delivered. He could have meant just those who survived physically to the end of the siege would be delivered. But the whole idea was perseverance, whether you live or die. So the bowls are an anti-day of atonement. The Yom Kippur means day of coverings. Apocalypse means uncovering. Revelation is an uncovering. So Jesus was on the cross naked, uncovered, and by being uncovered, he was the day of coverings. His nakedness led to our covering of our sins. So in Revelation, he's described as now being robed. He's now covered. He's not Adam, he's Joseph. The Genesis step of the book is he's not Adam who was in charge of the food. He's Joseph in charge of the food. And he's covered. And then he's going to expose those who had murdered him and were murdering the Christians. And that's, so the apocalypse there is, it's not just a revelation of Christ, it's an expose of those who were claiming to be the true kings of Israel, and their overt and even subtle, like the Judaizers spreading false doctrine in the church. They were all going to be uncovered, which is why they say, cover us from the face of him, like let the rocks and hills cover us. Like it's all about, well, the atonement, the covering, we rejected the blood of Christ and there's no more sacrifice for sin. And now we will atone for the blood. His blood is upon our own heads. We have to seek covering from him. And so the whole idea of the book is this huge day of coverings, and the day of atonement for Jerusalem was her blood was on her own head, and she was going to pay for the blood of the saints with her own blood. And that's where you read Josephus and you read about all the, Jesus said, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and your children. Yeah. He knew what was coming. And so, she's a woman with a cup. She's the woman in Numbers 5 who faces a test of adultery, and she's got to drink the cup. And if she's guilty, she'll be barren. And if she's not guilty, she'll be fruitful. But of course she drinks it and then she's cut off. I will kill her children with death. That's what it's about. You're going to be cut out of history. You'll have no offspring. You'll be, people ask why Judaism is still around today. And it's a pillar of salt. They looked back and they're still there, but they're barren. They would sow the land. The Romans later would sow the crops with salt to prevent people from keep them, that they have no food. The idea of barrenness with salt as well was with Elisha putting the salt into the well to heal the wombs of the women because it was causing miscarriages. So Jerusalem is rendered barren, spiritually barren, and without spiritual children, but also without a land. That's the seals are the day of Pentecost and the giving of the law of the Spirit. The trumpets are the result of that, because it divides Israel into consciously into two parts, where you've got the true church and the false church. Then both of them take on a Gentile component as well, because Satan's only way of doing things is to counterfeit what's true. God's created a Jew-Gentile body. Satan has to create a Jew-Gentile body to respond. But then, of course, what does Jesus do? He sets the Romans against the Jews. He sets these two halves because, as Daniel says, the iron and the clay, they're not going to stick. They can't hold together. The clay is red, which is Edom, which is Esau, which is the Herods. So it's going to fall apart. God knits things together miraculously, even Jew and Gentile, as James Jordan says. Paul's a tent maker. He's stitching Jews and Gentiles together in a new tabernacle, but Satan tries to put these things together, but they don't hold together. So it's like the unity of the Tower of Babel, which is why Jerusalem is a spiritual Babylon. It's just mud bricks. It's going to fall down. God's going to blow on it, and it's going to collapse, which it does. So yeah, that's those three bits. That's the process. So I think that's when you understand that each section of the book has the same structure, but it's then working through this larger sevenfold pattern where as Jesus opens the scroll, it has the next stage of its effect. Then that has like blood, fire, and smoke. It's a process. And then in the atonement step is when God smells the savor, and Jerusalem is, your smoke will go up forever and ever. Like I've offered you as an offering. Anyway, you have been offered on behalf of the nations as a sacrifice. And that's the end of the old covenant order. Yeah. Sorry to rattle on so much.
No,
there's a lot happening. Yeah.
No, it's good. We're getting getting down on the nitty. I mean, you're getting down on the nitty gritty, but you're also looking at it from a larger point of view, which I think is a good way to study it. You mentioned the sea beast, land beast. What about the image of the beast and the mark of the beast?
Yeah, recently we had people talking. I mean, there's always people been talking about the mark of the beast, and getting either a barcode or some kind of chip via vaccination or something. If those things occur, and I mean, look, you had Jews who had to wear a patch under the Nazis. I'd say that all of those things are bad, but they are application. They are not interpretation. Right. There was a mark of the beast in the first century. It doesn't mean that there will never be a similar method of control. Yeah, we're given these things to make us wise so that we can apply them. Like the reformers, they identified the harlot with Rome. The Holy Rome had become unholy. Yeah. I'd say that because Rome was massacring reformers, their application was correct, but their interpretation was incorrect. It was just that Rome was now doing exactly what the Herods did in the first century. Yeah. It's trying to silence the testimony of the Word of God, the true testimony of Christ. But now it was more subtle because it was a Christian institution that was doing it. As I said, Satan keeps upping his game. Yeah. The snake's always going to get into the garden. That's when you've got to say, hang on, the voice coming out of here is not the water of life, it's wormwood. I can tell the difference. So the mark of the beast, I think the idea of the right hand and the forehead, I mean, you have the saints sealed in their right hand and the forehead. I think it's a similar thing. I know they're sealed in the forehead from memory, but the idea is that it's inherently a spiritual mark, but I think that it's referring to the phylacteries. Like the law says that you're to bind the words of God on your forehead, and of course you've got the Jews who actually physically do that. I think they do it on their left hand though, with the straps and the little book with the box with the word. But the idea was that it's having a go at those who were loyal to the temple. Yeah. And because the temple was now beholden to, unlike Abraham, who refused to make any covenants with anybody because he's like, no, I'm answerable to God and I have to stay separate. They were, and like they did, Isaiah talks about how they made covenants with Egypt and other nations and sent envoys because they weren't trusting God for victory over the nations or to convert the nations. They had to make these treaties. And so first century Jerusalem was guilty of this same kind of statecraft where they were making treaties with Rome, as Jesus said, marrying and intermarrying. That's what it was all about. These political intermarrying to gain state power and to buy protection. And so if you were now part of the old order and of the temple and the Herods as this kind of priest kingdom, then you were not on the side of Christ. So the mark of the beast there is just basically a statement of loyalty to the old order.
Yeah.
Buying and selling is referring to the temple shekels. You know, even though that has an outcome in the economy, everything starts in the garden. And so if you're banned from the temple rites and bringing your sacrifices to the temple, then that's it. You're ostracized from the worship. So it's using land imagery to describe what's happening in the garden in that sense. Jordan brings that out really well when he talks about Genesis, where you had the garden, but then all of the gold and precious stuff was down in Havilah and Ophir. And, you know, the nations the kings of the world would bring their riches to the tabernacle of God. Pharaoh involuntarily gave all of his riches for the tabernacle, you know. So buying and selling is the idea of bringing your glory to God and making your offerings. So they were banned from that. Yeah. But we can still apply it, you know, like people will always try and mark us off as individuals to break up our autonomous nuclear family structure or our national structure. Those things are God-given. They're natural boundaries, and they have to try and deal with us as individuals to gain control. That's what's happening at the moment. Yeah.
So I take it that the image would be the temple?
Yes. So the idea is, and once again Jordan points it out, that the 10 words were graven words, graven with the finger of God. In a sense, they're 10 fingers on 2 tablets, like 2 hands. That's why it says Moses, when he broke them, he threw them out of his hands, you know, like, that's what he's saying there. It's these tablets are basically the method with which we take hold of the world with God's blessing. If they follow those 10 laws, then God would bless them, and they would, you know, submission to heaven brings dominion on earth. So the words, heaven is the mouth, then we have God's hands, and then we have our feet taking dominion, standing, you know, Revelation's got the angels standing on the land and the sea, taking dominion over the Jews and the Gentiles. So, you know, it's top to bottom. That's it's a tabernacle as well. You know, the tabernacle didn't have any feet, didn't have any pillars, didn't have any legs, but the temple was standing. It had landed. It's not a flying tabernacle like in Zechariah. It's come down. Its landing gear has come down. And now it's standing with its feet, you know, and also in Solomon's temple, the altar was now next to the bronze sea. So the land and the altar was the four-cornered land, and the bronze sea was the sea. And in a sense, the temple's standing on the land and the sea because it now Solomon had dominion over Israel, but also the surrounding nations were submitting to the worship of God. Obviously, they blew it. Yeah. So Revelation, Jesus fulfills that in Revelation. And now I've lost my track. But anyway, the image of the beast was they're still building the old temple, thinking that they're Solomon. You know, I mean, the 666 refers to Solomon's amassing 666 talents of gold in his first year in disobedience to the laws of Moses concerning Israel's kings. Don't amass gold, don't have lots of wives, and don't have lots of horses and chariots or weapons. So it's basically gold, guns, and girls. Okay, which is basically America now. You know, like America's been the source, a source of missionaries for the whole world. But it's like with Solomon's kingdom, you know, things when we have God's gifts, we tend to go bad, and those are the 3 temptations that Moses knew that Israel's kings would fall into. And so anyone who has power, David, you know, the kings always have concubines because they want to have more kids so they can establish their dynasty. It's not just about sex; it's about power. So the image of the beast, and also it says, here is wisdom. That's another reference to Solomon. Sure. It's like you guys, you've built your house. You think you've built your house on a rock, your temple, but you've actually built it on the sand between the Jews and the Gentiles, between the land and the sea. And it's going to come crashing down when the storm comes, which is obviously the Roman invasion. Jesus said to the disciples, by faith, you will cast this mountain into the sea. Not any mountain. People say, oh, what's the mountain in your life? It's no. The mountain was Mount Zion.
Right.
And then Revelation, you see a flaming mountain being cast into the sea, where the apostles' testimony has turned Zion into Sinai. And God's glory has come, and he's going to, like the burning mountain is Sinai. They've disobeyed the law. So he's going to drag them all the way back to Mount Sinai and destroy them. And then Israel becomes common once again as the nation that was lifted up from the sea is then cast back down. So there's no, people say once again, what about the Jews today? No, they're like the Levite who has finished his priestly course. He becomes common again. He has no special holy component. He's not set apart in any way. Israel is now just another mission field. There's no further. God doesn't treat them in any special way anymore. Yeah. They're like the elders who cast their crowns down. In that sense, their role's finished. Mm. So the image of the beast is a golden calf joke, but also a reference to Solomon, where they thought they were building Solomon's temple. They thought they had God's blessing, which is why the zealots kept fighting. They had initial successes, and they thought, God's on our side. And it's like, no, this is a trap. Yeah.
Okay, so what about the deadly head wound and the resurrection of the beast? Yeah,
Jordan sees the heads of the beast as being the various Roman empires. Mm-hmm. So there's the four beasts in Daniel, but this one's got multiple heads, and he works his way through the beginning with Julius Caesar, and he says that the old order was wounded, but then it's revived, and I think that's the seventh head, and I think it's So I can't remember where the break was there, whether it started with Nero, but I think it was. That's when the Romans didn't turn bad until Nero. Up until Nero, the Romans were protecting the Christians from the Jews.
Yeah,
and so the four beasts in Daniel were like big guard dogs. That's one thing I love the way that he points it out, because we always think of these beasts as being bad. But he's like, no. Just as God has four beasts around his throne in heaven, as beasts on a leash as his guardians. Yeah. And Solomon had lions down the stairs in front of his throne. So God was using these beasts like four horns around the altar to protect his people. But then when the guard dog went bad, God would have to, have them put down and he'd have a new one. So when Babylon turned bad, like God converted Nebuchadnezzar, which is just the most amazing thing when you read it. And Nebuchadnezzar sends this gospel message out to everyone in the whole world, and you're like, wow, that's just amazing. Like, who would think that? That's like Roman, like Nero's Rome being converted later on,
pretty much.
And Rome is the fourth beast. So, but the fourth beast turns bad under Nero and gets rabid and then starts eating everybody, attacking. And that's when it receives this. I think it's been wounded by the gospel in a sense, but then it's revived and it goes bad, and that's when, so that's the beast. But then the Herods become the face of the beast. They become the mouthpiece for this. It's not an animal we know on earth. It's not described in any way that we could say, that's a tiger or that's a whatever, a leopard or whatever they are. But this is something it's a mix of everything. But so that was its revival, was like the last ditch, kind of like when if you watch the first Terminator movie, when they think he's been destroyed, but he comes back again, and he's even scarier than ever, So that's the idea. It's this last ditch. We thought the battle was done, but no, and he's he's this is the real deal now. And it's a bit like when Satan, God uses his people as bait. He does that at the Exodus when they're trapped at the Red Sea and Pharaoh's like, they can't get away.
Mm-hmm.
They're sitting ducks.
Yeah.
And it's a trap.
Yeah.
It happens in the book of Esther. And when Haman's decree says that anybody who wants to attack the Jews and plunder them can do so. And they're sitting ducks. And Haman is descended from Esau via Amalek. So it's a Jacob and Esau thing again.
Mm-hmm.
And God's people are sitting ducks, and God says, no, you're going to win. Like, you're the bait in the trap, but it's a trap. And the end of Revelation actually refers to that in the event that's still future to us, where Satan's finally unbound. He's not currently unable to gather the nations as one against the church. If he did that now, we'd be gone. But God keeps them. Jesus keeps the nations fighting against each other. Every time they try to build a European Union or whatever, it falls apart. God comes and destroys their Babel. It just can't hold together. But at the end, Satan's released for a short time. What does he do? He gathers the nations, and it actually alludes to the events in the book of Esther, where it's a trap. What this does is, because all of God's enemies suddenly think they have the upper hand, they expose themselves. And it's, and then God's like, aha, now you've come out of the woodwork. I'm going to wipe you out. And he does. And so it's basically just a mopping up operation. So in the first century, it was the same sort of a deal where God's enemies now show themselves and they are rabid. Satan himself cannot resist the fruit on the tree. Whether it's Jesus on the cross or the 144,000, even though he's been warned that it's going to bring about, God's going to bring victory from the jaws of defeat. God constantly tempts Satan with the same thing that he tempted mankind with. Here's the fruit. Here's the fruit of the womb. Here, what are you going to do? And Satan just loses it, and he can't resist the temptation. He's like, God is a man. I can't resist. I have to kill him. Even though I've read the scriptures, I know it's going to bring my downfall. Like Adam, I was warned, and he does it anyway.
That's interesting. Wow.
Just there's just this irony, and that's why in Genesis people have a go at they have a go at Abraham for lying, and they have a go at Jacob for lying, and whatever. But these were acts of heroism. All the way, Genesis is all about outsmarting the serpent and beating him at his own game, like the Hebrew midwives. They lied to Pharaoh, and God blessed them.
Yeah,
because they were like
right.
Eve outsmarting the serpent. And so it's all, and Jesus all the way through, it's about Solomon saying, bring me a sword. Job offering his daughters. People say, oh, how could he do that? It's like, no. This was a trick. He knew what they were going to say. Like Solomon saying, bring me a sword, I'll cut the baby. He exposed their hearts. When God offers a temptation, it exposes their hearts. So in the first century, when the Christians become vulnerable, all the baddies expose their hearts. It shows who they really are before God. And those who said they were of God, like the Pharisees, etc., they were motivated only by hatred. When you read the stuff that they wrote, even about their own common people, they were entirely motivated by hatred. They weren't good guys. There were a few that were converted, but it's pretty serious. So what was the question again? But anyway, the wounded. That's right. So basically, that was Satan's last-ditch Terminator, back from the dead. You can't kill me. I'm even more powerful than ever. It's the opposite of Jesus being Obi-Wan, saying, if you strike me down, I'll become more powerful than ever. Yeah. And then, actually the whole first century history works through the first Star Wars movie. It's just it. That someone says Jesus was a pacifist. They're like, no. He's like Obi-Wan. He knows when to put down his lightsaber and be killed, and he knows when to blow up the Death Star and everybody in it. And that was the Jewish war. So there's a time and a place. They had their warning. Now the time is, he turned the other cheek, but then they slapped him again, and now there's two witnesses against them.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So we'll fast forward past a few chapters. I want to jump to the millennium now. How do you view the 1,000 years, the first resurrection and second death?
Yeah, firstly, I think the second death is related to it sounds a bit weird, but the two goats on the Day of Atonement. And we said, as I said, that this was a big Day of Atonement against Israel because they rejected Christ's blood. They trampled it underfoot, and now they would be held, they would atone for their own sins. So the first goat was the first death, and that's the one that was offered up, was burnt on the altar and offered up to God. It went to heaven, like Jesus went up in a cloud. Okay, that's what the picture is. He ascended. It says whole burnt offering, but the word literally is olah, which means go up. It's an ascension offering. So that's the book of Leviticus. Noah offered ascensions. So the first goat was an ascension that went to heaven, and the second goat was sent out to the wilderness, and it carried the sins of the people. So the first goat was actually blessed, was the blessings of the covenant. And, Israel went from down in Egypt up to Canaan with a pillar of fire and cloud. It was an ascension. So the second goat was the second death. So in other words, the first death is the martyrs. They were the ones who were killed and went up to heaven to God. The second death was the Jews who had rejected Christ, and they were going to be sent out. All the sins, they would bear all their sins, atoning for their own sins and the sins of the rest of the nations. Like Israel, Jerusalem copped the brunt of the judgment. Rome was shaken but not destroyed. They had 4 emperors in 1 year in 69, I think. So Rome was shaken, and then they had a new dynasty after that, which was actually was better in some ways, at least initially. So the second death refers to those who have rejected God and are paying for their own sins. Obviously, people think the first death is physical death and the second death is spiritual death. I don't think that's, even though that is still true, I don't think that's what this is sort of so much referring to. But, but the idea was that the martyrs would only suffer physical death and then they would have eternal life. So there is that element of it. But the first meaning is liturgical. And I think, when you had Jerusalem destroyed and the zealots who went out to Masada, that's a great miniseries if you watch that, made in the early 80s with Peter O'Toole, just the story of Masada. It doesn't take sides. But the idea is that these Jewish zealots who'd survived, when they went out into the wilderness, and there they were all slaughtered. And it's like they were the goat that was sent out, into the martyrs ascended to heaven. And, hang on a sec. I've just getting a call there. So the second death it's referring to the division of Israel between the good goat and the bad goat. The millennium, once again, as like with 666, the number is a symbol. And, James Jordan's great on chronology, and he says, well, it was 1,000 years from when Abraham almost offered Isaac, he did offer him, Isaac on Mount Moriah, until when David bought the same site for the temple. So it was exactly the same spot. And then Moriah was renamed Zion. So that was 1,000 years. And then it's 1,000 years of worship in tents. There's no permanent house. And from the time that Solomon, I think from the time he finished the construction at some point of the temple to when Herod's temple was destroyed was another 1,000 years. So in Revelation, that has become a meme, like the 666. It's loaded with meaning, historical meaning, but it's not a literal symbol. The Herods didn't have 666 talents of gold. It's saying you have broken God's laws for kings, and those who are judging you have, like, one greater than Solomon is here, and you have rejected him. So 1,000 years is simply the administration of the church as a long but limited period of time in this new temple made of people. And so, so you understand, the year 1000, everyone was panicking, and then you've got other people saying, well, no, you've got to take it literally, but that's not how any of the symbols works. The numbers are always they're referring to historical events, but now they become a hyperlink to something in the past. Everything in Revelation is a hyperlink to previous scriptures. So, so we are currently in this time where the gospel is spreading like leaven in the dough, gradually transforming the world, and then it will come to an end. So the first resurrection, there's a bit of contention here with people. I believe that there was a resurrection in the first century, that all of the old covenant saints and the new covenant first century martyrs were taken by God. They were taken like Enoch. They were not, But the reason is that, once again, it's the garden land world architecture. Jesus was resurrected in the garden, and then he was taken to heaven. Then you had the saints massacred in the land, and that avenged the blood of Abel. Jesus' blood speaks of salvation rather than vengeance. I believe they were taken to heaven. They received their inheritance, and that's what Revelation's about, that God wiped all their tears from their eyes. It's talking about the promises to those who were waiting. And it's in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul says, no, those who are dead, will precede us. And he's not saying it'll just be like a 1-2, I don't think. He's saying that they will be taken first, and I suspect he was among their number, even though he wasn't aware of it at the time. And then he says, then those who remain, and then he's looking forward to the end of time. So once again, it's garden, land, world. He does this in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about Christ the first fruits, then those who are Jesus, who belong to Christ at his coming, and that was I think it was around 66. It was just at the beginning of the siege. I think that's when it happened. Josephus does talk about armies flying through the clouds. I don't know if they were angels or saints, but there's quite a few historians who record that. And then he says, then Christ, after having put every enemy under his feet, then it talks about the final judgment. And so even though it seems like it all happens pretty quickly, it's the same as Adam in the garden, Cain in the land, and then the flood of the world. There's a gap where you have the cultural version of the same sin, but in a larger domain, and it takes longer. So Paul's concerned about the order of things, 1, 2, 3. We have that final world resurrection to come. So in Revelation, the first resurrection is the one that happened just before. The saints, you see the saints in heaven calling down the curses of the law upon Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So they've already ascended. So that's the first resurrection. And then the second resurrection is the one at the end of history, the final event. So the full preterists kind of try and squish Revelation 20 into the first century and tell us that the millennium lasted for 40 years, which is
tough.
That's tough. You're mixing your metaphors there.
Yeah,
40 years is a time of testing. Why didn't it just say for 40 years if it's using symbols? Yeah. So
it's tough.
But once again, we've got a God who kicks the can. People say, God is so capricious and he's so quick to judge, and every now and then he will. Like Ananias and Sapphira, it's like they got what they deserved straight away.
Right.
But that was a warning to everybody. Mm-hmm. And then we realize how merciful God is.
Yeah.
God didn't kill Adam and Eve. He offered a sacrifice on their behalf, and the sacrifice bore their death. Yeah. It was a real death. God didn't kill Cain. He let him off the hook temporarily, but then he's got a long fuse, but he has a fuse. Same with Israel's kings, the laws in Leviticus where it says the sins that have a death penalty. David committed 2 of those sins, and yet God let him off the hook because he repented. There's always mercy. It's when, like in the first century, Jesus forgave them for they've been led astray. And I think it's Numbers. Where is it? Is it Numbers 15? Somewhere in Numbers where it talks about if someone's led astray into sin, there's mercy, but if it's high-handed sin, then they will be cut off from among the people. So Jesus forgave those who'd been led astray to kill him, but then it's like AD 70 is Jesus saying, Father, don't forgive them. They know exactly what they're doing. this is high-handed sin now, and they'll be cut off, and Jerusalem was utterly cut off like Jericho. So, I think a lot of it is applying the processes we see in the Torah. Revelation just brings it all home in a cultural sense. All those things that you were warned about now, they're coming to fruition. I think another thing Jordan brings out is the fact that when Jesus talks to the 7 churches, he's nipping the same sins in the bud, like Jezebel, Balaam, all those things. But then he shows them Jerusalem, where those sins have not been nipped in the bud, and they are now full grown, and they're thorns. It's like the castle in Sleeping Beauty, like it's just overgrown with thorns. Like Cain is a human thorn, He draws blood. He's not a tree of life. He's a creeping vine of death, And so I think so when Paul talks about a thorn in the flesh, I think he's talking about, his brothers who just keep drawing blood, possibly. We don't know, but that's the symbolism. He's got this thorn and he's like, can you deal with it? No.
Goodness. Wow. Yeah.
Wow. Because that, just a bit more on that, there's always a link between the land and the womb. There's a curse on Adam working the land and a curse on Eve's offspring. And Jesus says they'll be eating and drinking, fruit of the land, marrying and giving in marriage, fruit of the womb. So calling Cain a thorn, as Jordan does, treason, he's got a book called Trees and Thorns. There's always this equivalent between what's growing in the land. And you see that in Isaiah too, where he talks about, I was expecting grapes and I got bitter grapes. Talks about thorns, things that will draw blood rather than bring life. So I think when Paul mentions a thorn in the flesh, could have been anything, but the symbolism's consistent. So I think it's the Judaizers, the ones who just, like he was a thorn. He was out there killing Christians, thinking he was doing the work of God, murdering his brothers. That's the point. And the first epistle of John is all about this. Jesus trying to tell them, any Jew, and he's writing mostly to Jews, any Jews motivated by hatred, who is not loving, who is doing these things, you know them by their fruits. What are they? And he's showing them how to discern between the true brothers who claim to be working for God and the false brothers. It's just another thing I have to throw in. John's got 3 epistles, and the first one is judging the serpents in the garden. And the second one, like God did when he came to the garden, he deals with the serpent, and then he deals with the woman, and that's the second letter where he's talking to Kyria, that's a female version of Lord. And then he deals with a man. He deals with Gaius, and that's the male version of Gaia, which is Earth. So John's 3 epistles deal with the serpent, then with the woman, then with the man. And then in Revelation, you have the beast, which is a corporate serpent, the dragon, and then you have the woman, who's the harlot, that's Jerusalem, and then you have the man, who's Balaam, the false prophet. So it's like Eden on steroids. It's the same conspiracy. Wow. Yeah. So that's what I mean. The symbolism is consistent. So whenever you see a thorn, you're supposed to go back to the curse in the Garden of Eden, and and human thorns. And of course, the crown of thorns. Who put it there? It's wearing the curse, which is an obvious one. We get that one. Anyway, sorry, rambling on again.
No, that's good.
But it's just, look, there's a lot of people today who are into symbolism and fiction, and there's a lot of really smart fiction out there. What gets me is the fact that a lot of people who are in the Christian academies don't bother with typology, and they're missing most of the picture. So many times they're clueless as to what's really going on because they keep isolating it into little bits and not looking at it as one picture. But also, too, they treat the average Christian as an idiot that can't cope with this stuff. When I know the kind of games that my kids play, video games, they are so smart. Like, you've got to have your wits about you, and you've got to be able to think. Like people are so savvy that they can cope with this stuff. And there's some things I've shared with people who've never heard this sort of approach before, and the lights are just going on because they know all the texts, and all of a sudden you're making, it's like the links between the synapses, all the cells were there, and all of a sudden you turn the power on, and then suddenly just like, oh, wow, now I can see what's going on, And I was the same when I came across James Jordan. All of a sudden, and the Bible's so consistent that you learn something in one spot, you can apply it in so many other places. And then you start to get the jokes. Like, as I said, I'm working through Isaiah, and there's so many things there that were mysteries. And all of a sudden you say, now I get what you're doing. I understand why you said that. I understand why you put these things together. I understand why you shifted from this to that. There's a lot of stuff going on, but you've got to read cumulatively. So,
Yeah, and that's really, as you mentioned before, that's the book of Revelation. I mean, it's, I love studying eschatology because when you study a book like Revelation, you're studying the entire Bible. Let me ask you a follow-up on the first resurrection. Actually love the interpretation that there was a resurrection because that's exactly what it says, the first resurrection. There's so many different alternative ways to explain that one, but God forbid it did actually be a resurrection. Are people, you mentioned Enoch, are you seeing people being taken alive in this resurrection, or is it just resurrection of the dead?
It's a tough one because we're only told things in sort of symbols that reflect patterns in the Old Testament, and that's why the garden land world pattern, like the history from Adam to Noah works through the same pattern in Israel's feasts, and the flood is the atonement, a day of coverings, the whole world's covered, but Enoch is taken as the first fruits. So when you see that God's actually working through, Adam is the Sabbath, he messes it up on day 6. And so he doesn't enter into God's rest on day 7. And then you have Cain and Abel, and Abel's like the Passover. He's killed. Then you have the family tree gets split into 2, the priestly line and the kingly line. Enoch is taken as the first fruits. Then, as in Revelation, and that's like Jesus who ascends as the Lamb in Revelation, it's the same pattern. Then you have spiritual warfare, and you have a division between the believers and the church and the unbelievers. In the first in the history in Genesis 6, it's the sons of God are not angels; they're the priestly line, because it's 2 family trees now. You have the 2 trees in the garden, and then the priestly and kingly trees. Adam steals the kingdom by stealing the kingly tree, same temptation that Jesus suffered in the wilderness. Then you have the 2 trees of Abel and Cain, priestly brother, kingly brother. Cain was the firstborn, but he usurped his brother's role and pushed in first. And like kingdom first, Adam was kingdom first. So then you've got the 2 family trees, and you have Lamech as the 7th from Adam on the kingly side, and you've got who was on that? Wasn't Enoch? Maybe it was Enoch. Anyway, the 7th from Adam, Enoch, the 7th from Adam. I think you
7th, yeah.
Yeah. So once again, you've got Enoch versus Lamech. It's this diagram like a family tree, and there's the good priestly guy who's taken, and in the tabernacle, it's the same pattern in the tabernacle where you've got the ark, and then you've got the veil, which is the division. Then you've got the lampstand as the kingdom, and the table as the priesthood. And Enoch is lifted up as bread and wine in a sense and taken to heaven as the first fruits. But then you've got an intermarriage between the 2 sides, and it seems that the kingly side, it seems to me, because of the gifts that the kingly side had with metalwork and like the Philistines who could work with iron, they had all the gifts, they had all the technology. I think their polygamy was the way that they were getting around the curse on the womb. It says men began to multiply on the earth, and they were basically having lots of kids by having lots of wives, which was breaking God's order. But then you have the poor priestly line who become second-class citizens, and they were tempted to intermarry. And this theme of intermarriage keeps happening through the Bible, where God wants to put them back together, but it's got to be submission to heaven, priesthood first, and then dominion on earth, kingdom.
Yeah.
If Adam had submitted to God, God would have given him the dominion that he promised, but he stole the dominion. Jesus submitted to God in heaven and then was given all power in heaven and earth, So that's the two trees in Eden are there all the way through, whether it's the two pillars in the temple. Isaiah structures a lot of his passages around this architecture, which is why seems a bit weird, it's architecture. So the intermarriage there meant that the sacrifices ended, and the curse on the land and the womb, which is what the offerings of Abel and Cain were there to hold back, stopped because there was no more priesthood. And so in Revelation, the temptation is once again to intermarry. And that's why Jesus said, it'll be like it was before the flood. They'll be eating and drinking, probably eating meat to get around the curse on the ground that Cain suffered, and they'll be marrying and intermarriage. And all of this is about stealing God's gifts without submitting to him. And that's what we always do, God says, Adam, I bought you a car. Adam takes the keys and takes it for a joyride and crashes it. He's not interested in having lessons. In Revelation, Jesus has got the keys. Hey, God's given me the car. Now I'm the driver, So, yeah. But anyway, so Enoch was taken as the first fruits in that pattern. Jesus is taken as the first fruits in that same festal pattern in Revelation. But then it's cumulative. So Jesus is the first fruits in the garden. The 144,000 are the first fruits to God and the Lamb in the land.
Right.
And that's why, so you have a resurrection in the garden, a resurrection in the land, and I think they were taken. Possibly some living people were taken. Jordan says that there's such a break between the certainty of the apostles and their inspiration and the diverse opinions between the church fathers that does seem to show that there is a lot of people missing.
That's crazy.
There's a break. He said, in a sense, we've got to start from scratch, because even though there was a transference of wisdom and whatever, there's this break.
Yeah.
So
right.
It wouldn't surprise me if some people were taken alive, But I believe that if it did happen, it happened at the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem around 66 or in 66.
Sure.
Because that was the 7 year period that the dispensationalists think is future happened then. And you've got 3.5 years of persecution of the saints. And then you've got 3.5 years of the days of vengeance upon Israel. And that's the two goats. The first half is the first goat that goes to heaven. There it is. They go to heaven. The first goat goes to heaven, big day of atonement. And then the second goat basically goes to hell. And that's 66 to 70. So that's another liturgical support for the fact that God took the first fruits to heaven. I mean, a wave offering was always lifting something up. Mm-hmm. That's what it was. So, and also too, it ties into the fact that the Levites weren't given any land, and that pictures the curse on the land for Adam, and that was withheld mitigated through sacrifices. And then you had the virgins who voluntarily served at the tabernacle, bearing the curse on the womb. They were voluntarily barren, and that's what happened to Japheth's daughter. He offered her, but he would have offered a sacrifice in her place. She went and served as a virgin at the tabernacle, and so he had no dynasty. So she mourned her virginity by ascending mountains. It's always going up, Mm-hmm. There's the word ascend again. So I think they were taken to heaven as the first fruits, and they were taken like Enoch. All of a sudden, they're gone. So yeah, as Jesus was taken up out of their sight. That's the thing. Once you see the pattern, you go, oh, okay, I know what's next.
Yeah.
As I said, I'm going through Isaiah, which is a tough book, but once you know the architecture and the pattern, you go, something to do with this should be next. There it is.
Yeah.
You know the tune. There it is.
That's crazy. Man. That's wild.
Yeah.
I have a couple follow-up questions. So let me ask about I have one more on the resurrection, but before I go there, I want to get some clarity on the second death. That's not future. You're saying that was first century, the second death?
Well, it does. Once again, it seems that God kicks the can. The full preterists point out that Daniel talks about a resurrection of the good and the evil in Daniel 12 at the same time.
Right.
But then they say, well, if you believe in a future resurrection, then that's not the case. But in Revelation, it says the rest of the dead.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I think the full preterists are correct in pointing out what Daniel says. But I think that Revelation, once again, God kicks the can and says, okay, the good guys are going to get their reward now, but the bad guys, I'm going to put them on pause for now until the end. And I think that they will get the second death in an eternal sense. Then they will, the unbelievers will get their just deserts at the end. But I think it's also the fact that by putting that off until the final world judgment, every tongue will confess in one go. Yeah. Everyone from the judgment on the land and the judgment on the world will confess as one, because Jesus will then be fully vindicated, not just in the garden and the land, but also in the world. And, one thing we think about justice and mercy, but in God's mercy, he often delays things. He didn't cut off Israel in the wilderness. He didn't cut off Israel when the kings went bad. Jesus didn't have the city destroyed at his crucifixion when he could have called 10,000 angels, legions of angels. So the idea that God is patient and kind and will often break his own word, like people say, well, Adam didn't die when he sinned, so he must have only died spiritually. I'm like, no. Certainly there were spiritual consequences, but the death was borne by an animal. So, whenever Satan uses God's law to entrap people and he weaponizes it, that's what legalism is. So Satan gets Adam and Eve to sin so that God will have to kill them and Satan will get the inheritance. He's like the butler in the Aristocats. He's got to get the cats killed so he can get the money. That's what Satan does every time. He's like, I have to get these people to sin so that God will do what he said and kill them. And God keeps pulling another card out of his sleeve, like animal sacrifice or, whatever. And even then, with the destruction of the world, God's card was Noah building an ark. Like, well, okay, there's a way through this judgment for the faithful. Yeah. He always provides a way of escape. Yeah. So, that's what I think. And that's why Jesus called the Pharisees of sons of their father, the devil, because they used the law to entrap and condemn people. Wow. Yeah. And that's what you see with the woman caught in adultery. We all say, well, where was the man? Obviously, but they entrapped her so that they could use her to trap Jesus.
That's crazy.
Satan trapped Eve in order to trap Adam. And so the story of the woman caught in adultery is a reprise of the Garden of Eden. And the serpent is the men with the rocks ready to have her killed. And there's Eve, and Jesus is both Adam, a good Adam, and the Lord who comes to offer the sacrifice because he is the sacrifice. So it's the same. So when he writes in the sand the first time with the finger of God writing the 10 Commandments, I'm sure it's thou shalt not kill or murder. That's what they were doing. They're of their father, the devil, who was a murderer from the beginning. And the second time would have been don't commit adultery. And those are the two central commands, the kingly sins of murder and adultery. You murder people to maintain your throne, and you have adultery to have lots of sons to establish your dynasty. So, that's what he's writing, the kingly sins. And that's what the devil does. And today, people say, oh, you're a legalist because you're telling me what God's law says. No. I'm telling you to save you, not to kill you. It's Satan, his strategy is entrapment. So when the sons of God marry the daughters of mankind, of Adam, it's entrapment. They're being tempted. They see these daughters. They're like Eve seeing the fruit on the tree. Oh, gee, they look good. And it's like, well, no. If you wait on God, Noah and his sons were all monogamous. that's important. And they didn't have kids. Like Noah had kids, but none of his sons had kids. So they were waiting in the ark for the fruit of the land, a new earth, and the fruit of the womb. And all of the animals in there in pairs didn't have kids. They were all Adam and Eve pairs all the way through, waiting for the promises of dominion, offspring, and food. And if you have food, you have a personal future. And if you have offspring, you have a cultural future. And so, whereas the culture before that had stolen those things from God, thinking they would have an eternal dynasty, Noah and his sons waited. But then, of course, Ham tries to steal the inheritance from his brothers. So it starts again.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
But anyway, that explains Jesus' reference to eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage.
Yeah.
It's the fruit of the land and the fruit of the womb. So everything, if you don't read the Bible with the Garden of Eden in mind at every step, including Revelation, you're going to misinterpret things. Even Ezekiel's reference to donkeys. Okay, it's all about fertility. Okay, so yeah.
Wow. Okay. So that was my understanding of the second death. Something you said made me question it, so I'm glad I got clarity on that. But I want to go back to the first resurrection, and my question is there a distinction between those that were part of that first resurrection in the first century when that happened, and those that are waiting for the second coming in the intermediate state? So those after, right?
Yeah,
are they adjoining everybody else?
I'm not real sure on that one. Yeah, so like basically, if I drop dead right now, would I go straight to heaven, like Paul says, to be absent in the body is to be present with the Lord? I don't. I think. I mean, the imagery behind a resurrection is a harvest, and so the idea that you would be in some sort of intermediate state, I'd say it's a definite possibility. But the idea of receiving a new body, that all happens at once. Like Jesus, the reason that other people came out of their graves at Jesus' resurrection was because one seed goes into the ground and more seeds come out. And so the sign of these people coming out of the graves and then going to Jerusalem to testify, they would have died again. It wasn't an eternal type. They didn't get their eternal bodies. It was like the other, like the raising of Lazarus. He died again. But it was a sign of a greater reality to come, in the same way that Abraham understood that the land of Canaan was a sign of the heavenly country. God works in layers. He keeps moving the goalposts. He instructs us using natural things like human sons so that we can understand sons of God. That's how he works. The natural fruits are always pictures of spiritual fruits. It's just how he works. So we have visible parents like human fathers, so that we then understand a concept of an eternal invisible father. And that's just how things are constructed. God gives us a physical temple so that we can now understand the church as a spiritual temple. So I don't know about the intermediate state. I don't know if we're conscious. I mean, it talks about us being asleep, so I think that's probably how we should take it. I think that if I died now, I'd be asleep, but it would just be like waking up in the next instant. All of a sudden, it consistent. Adam was put into a deep sleep as a picture of death. So, and Noah was in a deep sleep, from drinking wine in a godly way. He wasn't drunk. Abraham was put into a deep sleep. In each sense, they were put into a deep sleep in a symbolic death, because they were going. God was going to. It was like a nighttime. And God, when they woke up, would be, let there be light. This is now a new order, and I'm going to establish a new covenant in you. And so, that's a new era. And it's the same with dreams. God sends dreams because he's sending light in the darkness. It's a new beginning. It's a new creation. So I think, I think, look, when we die now, we'll just be asleep. Same as those who had fallen asleep before the first century resurrection. And then, they wake up and they're conscious again, but it's in, they're not aware of the time in between. That's how I take it at the moment. I think that's, I could be wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
and when it says, "Blessed are those who die in the Lord," I think that's referring to those who were afraid of martyrdom, because they would not really have to wait. Like Jesus had
Sure.
opened the door, and
Yeah.
it's like, no, you're gonna, like those who, though the kingdom of God was like those who had suffered over the previous 4,000 years were like the laborers who'd worked all day. And then these guys who were coming in at the end were like, no, you get your reward straight away.
Equal
Don't
pay.
be afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's probably the idea.
It's interesting you say that. I always find it perplexing when you read about Samuel getting called up from the dead, and he's sort of upset at Saul. He's like, "Dude, why are you disturbing my sleep?" That's what he says. Like,
yes.
Which is interesting, and that makes sense to me. When you say there's a first resurrection, it makes sense that the rest of the dead, both righteous and unrighteous, are both waiting for that second. That concept of asleep is really interesting, though. I know James B. Jordan writes about the Abraham's bosom, the first firmament heaven, and the veil being torn, representing the separation between that first firmament heaven and heaven where God dwells. And that's a picture of that resurrection, them being taken into the presence of God after, the end of the old covenant, which is really beautiful. So in some sense, I can kind of see, how do you reconcile that? I guess, would you take Paul's words to say to die is to be in the presence of the Lord in reference to that first resurrection? Or, I guess, how would you make sense of that?
I think possibly, the only way I could reconcile that is to say that the Bible often speaks of things from our perception. It's like, the two lights in the sky, they're exactly the same size. That's why we can have an eclipse. We now know that they're not the same size, but they look like they're the same size. And it talks of, the same, as he points out, the same way that we talk about the sun coming up and going down. So speaking of things from a human's perspective, perhaps that's what Paul's doing there.
Sure.
He knew that if he fell asleep, he would the next thing he knew, he would be in the presence of the Lord. But I think that's what makes sense. But also the fact that every day where we wake up, we go through our day, and then we go to sleep. Every day is, as he points out, morning and evening is a picture of death and resurrection. The biblical sevenfold pattern is found in every work day, and in a human life where you like the biblical pattern is you get up, you go to work, you do the work, you get the reward, you come home, have a meal, and then you go to sleep. Well, that's a human life in miniature. Like our career is a central part of our life. That's the time when we're most physically able. And then as we get older, people rely on our wisdom, and we have the rewards of having worked. And then we get to old age, and then we fall asleep. So I think sleep is the picture that's consistently given. But the difference is, because it's also the same pattern is found in the harvest year. At the end of the year, the last festival, booths or tabernacles, also known as ingathering, the idea is that if you've been faithful, you're gathered to your fathers. And that's the idea of someone being buried in the land. But if you were left unburied, the birds and the beasts would come and eat you, and you'd be scattered. And that's the idea of you have not been gathered to your fathers. You have disintegrated, like, you've just been scattered here and there, and there's no resurrection for you in that sense. Like, God's not going to put you back together. Like that's eternal death. That's why I think Naaman who requested for a truckload of soil from the Holy Land.
Yeah, he took
So
it.
he could be buried in it. I mean, it's the promise of and the idea that you wanted to be buried in the land. So and the first century resurrection was all about the resurrection from the land of Israel as a microcosm of all the dry land of the world, because it was a sacrificial substitute, to hold back the flood. That was another something God pulled from his sleeve. Satan's like, well, things have gone bad with Ham in the garden, and now they're going bad with the Tower of Babel and the land. Now we just have to wait for the world again, and God's going to have to destroy everyone, and he promised he wouldn't. So what does God do? He calls Abraham and sets up a miniature land, the land of Canaan. And that's why the prophets all use creation language. The end will come with a flood. Well, a flood of what? Troops. It's a social land and sea. The Jews of the land and the Gentiles of the sea. So God, once again, it's like when I was a kid, they didn't have CGI. So when you wanted to blow up a building or a mountain or something, you build a model.
Yeah.
And they're getting back to building models now, which is amazing. So God built a model, just like the tabernacle was a model of the universe, the cosmos. So Israel was a model, and the 12 tribes were a model of all the nations. So, that's how he got out of that one. He, once again, like with Adam, he put in a substitute. So to prevent another flood, he put in a substitute, land and sea. And I think that's the key to Revelation as well, because it talks about, judgment on the earth when it's really judgment on the land. All the tribes of the land will mourn. A beast coming up out of the sea is Neronic Rome coming up out of the nations, So once you get this sort of substitutionary image, it's no different than the Jews wouldn't eat the socket of the hip, because they understood that the animals were sacrificial representatives of people. So they got it. We don't. We're a bit thick. Yeah, we shouldn't be.
Yeah,
it's a modernist, modernist scientific mind that just doesn't get typological links too well. Although I think we do. I think we just switch it off when we come to the Bible for some reason.
Yeah, maybe right.
My goal is to get people reading the Bible the way they would watch a movie or read a novel, because it uses all the same devices and better. Like reading Tolkien is just a gateway drug to the Bible. Tolkien seems pretty shallow once you get into biblical typology. I'm not knocking him at all, but just like after getting into this sort of stuff, anything else is like, really? Is that all you got? This is so multi-layered,
absolutely,
and so rich. Like it's just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh wow. Okay. I'm going to go back to this first resurrection again. I think I have a couple of follow-up questions. I can't get off of it.
I know you keep putting the train back on the tracks. That's okay.
First resurrection. Do you believe that they got their heavenly bodies at this resurrection, or is that yet to come?
Well, my logic is that we see them sitting on thrones, so they must have had bums.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
And,
also, too, I think that the message there is that, like in the Old Testament, you see angels come down and take on human bodies, but then they tend to just kind of disappear. Like the angel that came and spoke to Samson's mother, the woman referring to Eve. It went up with the sacrifice in the flame. Yeah. The angels that went to Sodom as two witnesses just vanish pretty much. And I think the idea is that they come down, they take on human bodies, but in a sense they take on flesh, but they never took flesh to heaven. And that's the idea that the human form could not be accepted in heaven in that sort of a sacrificial sense. I know I said that the elders might have been, covenant heads from the Old Testament, but God's more concerned with the picture, and the image is that Christ was the first person to take a human body, take the flesh to heaven. And so to think that the first resurrection was only spiritual kind of says, well, okay, what was the point of Jesus taking a human body to heaven? In a sense, like the unchangeable God has changed in the sense that there is now a man in the glory. and the man is the image of God. Like the human form is a tabernacle, and the tabernacle is, Father, Son, and Spirit in its layout. So I think they did receive human physical bodies. I think that was the whole point, that it wasn't just kind of, smoke that went up to heaven. It was a transformed, glorious body. I mean, look, Jesus' body, his resurrection body was kind of a picture of that. It was a better version of he could now pass through closed doors. Like it's the idea that it's still a physical body, but it's people talk about the sort of the difference between the natural and the spiritual, but what we see in from the beginning is that God creates the natural and then clothes it in the spiritual. So Adam was natural and he was naked. When God returned, if Adam had obeyed, he would have been given a robe of righteousness and clothed with glory. He would have been anointed with the Spirit. He would have been God's prophet, a priest king and a prophet, because that's the order. That's how it goes.
Yeah.
You hear God, you act for God, and then you speak for God. So the prophet is the most mature. So the idea then of Jesus' resurrection body, it's still the natural body, but now it's clothed in the supernatural. That's the idea of a sacrifice ascending in flame and smoke. It's clothed in glory. So our supernatural bodies will still have the natural element. So the idea of people around us who are lost, who are still the natural man, it's not that the natural's bad, it's that it's not complete.
Sure.
It's not the finished product. It's still got to be, it's like you've got to put the meat in the oven, and then when it comes out, then it's glorious. Then, like God doesn't have raw meat. It's got to be cooked. He's got to smell it. The day of Pentecost, put the fire on the meat. And now all of a sudden we have, that's how God thinks. I call it God's kitchen. Whenever you're going through suffering, you're in God's kitchen. He's cutting you up, and something better is going to come out the other side. Like Job, at the end, he's not just a good cut of meat. He's now a meal. he's now a feast, but he feasts with God. So yeah, if you're suffering in any way, God's preparing you for something better. Yeah.
Okay, I got one more question on the resurrection, and then we'll move on. We'll try to get to our last chapter.
I'm doing my best, but
you're doing great.
The key is to see it as another expression of processes that we should already be familiar with. And they're the clue. Yeah.
I mean, I loved your explanation because we're all familiar with this idea of going to sleep every night and then we just wake up the next morning. So, like the concept of soul sleep it's not foreign. It's part of our everyday experience. So I do like that. My question for you is some people don't think it's a parable, but Lazarus and the rich man. How do you
it sounds dull, but architecture is the key to that one. The rich man is presented he's dressed in linen and scarlet, I think, or purple. And that's the colors that the priests used to wear. The priests of Israel were dressed in linen, which is white like a lamb. And then they had this red sash that flowed down onto the ground. And apparently I don't think it's in scripture, but it's in the traditions that when they had to carry stuff, they would grab the sash and throw it over their shoulder so it wouldn't drag on the ground. But basically, they were supposed to look like lambs who had been cut and were bleeding out onto the ground. And the sashes were made of blue, scarlet, and purple thread. I think they might have had some gold in there as well, which is holiness. But the blue is your blood in your veins. Scarlet is when it comes out. And then when it's oxygenated, it's blue, purple, and scarlet. When it's fully oxygenated, it's scarlet. So basically, they're just blood gushing. That's what they are. And then, so that's death. They are death, okay? But then after they sinned and didn't enter into the land like Adam and Eve, God clothed the Israelite men and women with a robe that had 4 blue tassels like 4 rivers. Okay, so each person, that's resurrection. That's baptism. Okay, they've got
Wow.
this water, it's blood. It's like in the Passover there was blood, and then in the Red Sea there was water. In Jericho they crossed through the Jordan, which is water, and then there's blood. So Moses had to tip out water, and it became blood on the ground, and that's a curse. But the priests had to tip the blood out like water on the ground, so the death became resurrection. It's the other way around. With Jesus, blood and water came out together, and it's like, well, if you believe, the blood's first, and if you don't believe, the water's first. If you believe, his blood is becoming water for you, and if you don't believe, the water that comes out here is going to be blood for your death. Okay, that's how it is. It's one is the water of life. The death is, the life is in the blood. But it's like the day of Peter's speech when he says the promises to you and your children. These guys had just called down the curse of the law upon themselves and their children five weeks before. I think that's how it works. And he's saying that blood that is on you. If you believe that blood is on you, that's going to be your destruction. If you believe that blood is on you for your life, that's the promise to you and your children and those far off. And of course, those who were far off were gathered into Jerusalem who didn't believe Paul. That blood on them was to their death. I don't see how we can't take Peter's speech to us directly. This was for Jews, the men of Israel. Anyway, what were you saying again? What were we talking about?
You're describing
blood and water.
You're describing the rich. You're describing the rich man.
Yeah, so that's right. Yeah, see how it's connected. But anyway, so he's dressed in priestly garb, and the idea was that priests are mediators, and this rich man, who had all the blessings, the kingly blessings of God, like Job did. God took all of Job was a priest king. God allowed Satan to take all of his kingly attributes, the fruit of the womb and the fruit of the land. That's what he lost, the things that God promised to Adam. But that was his kingly stuff. And then because he was a priest king, if you had to be physically perfect. And so what did God allow Satan to do? He corrupted his skin. He was no longer an acceptable sacrifice. And yet he was the one who was without spot. He was blameless before God. So spiritually he was blameless. So in the Lazarus and the rich man, Lazarus is covered in boils. He's the one who is supposedly not acceptable to God, and yet he's the one who the priesthood was not mediating for people. They were treating the commoners. I mean, you read some, as I mentioned before, you read some of the stuff that the Pharisees wrote. Not only could you not lend money to a commoner, they hated the Gentiles, they hated the Samaritans, but they hated their own common people, the Ha'aretz, people of the land. They absolutely despised them. Like if they said things like, oh, well, let them be gutted like a fish. Like they were just, I call this a perfect hatred because it was complete. Like it's like in Isaiah when he talks about they're sick from the top of the head to the foot, sole of the foot, or the other way around. Like the whole body is now sick. There's no cure. The only end for them is now death. We can't fix anything, So Lazarus, but when it talks about after they die, we have to think of the tabernacle because that's the context. The context is the temple. And so who has ascended? When you put an offering on the altar, it separated the good from the bad. Like when we die, our old flesh will not be, corrupt flesh will not be going with us in a sense, right? That will be dealt with. It'll be like the two goats, for each of us. It'll be like the two goats on the Day of Atonement. There'll be our redeemed self, and then the old self, the old man will be gone. So you put an offering on the altar, the smoke ascended to God, and God smelt it, and that was fragrant. But the ashes, the dust, like Adam, you return to the dust. The dust would fall down into the altar, and that's a place where there's fire, right? So in between, so you've got Lazarus is now purified as an offering. He ascends to heaven, and there he is at the table of showbread and wine with Abraham. And the rich man, he's fallen as ashes, not risen as smoke. He's fallen down as ashes, like the sons of Korah, been devoured by the earth, because the altar pictured the four-cornered land. So he's down inside the altar saying, could you just reach your finger and tip it in, put it into the laver, which is between heaven and earth, like the crystal sea? Could you just put your finger in there and reach down? And so basically that's the thing. He's gone down into the abyss, and as the unacceptable part of the sacrifice, he's like Adam. He's returned to the dust. And so Lazarus is up there having a feast now with his father, Abraham. And Abraham says, no, there's this huge gulf. So the gulf was between what was inside the tent and what was outside the tent in the altar. So it's the same with the sons of Korah. They were offering incense, thinking that they could ascend to God as fragrant smoke. What happened? No. The land swallowed them up. They were sucked down into what the altar pictured as dust. They returned to the dust, whole. And Isaiah uses that as a joke as well when he talks about all the pomp and glory of I think he's talking about Judah at that point. The land would come up like a giant mouth and swallow them whole, because they'd been so arrogant before God, thinking that they could ascend to heaven. So that's the picture. It's the architecture is the key. So it's not about the eternal state in a sense. It's about what was your role before God as a mediator, but then once again, it actually does picture what happened, that those who rejected Christ are still dead in their sins. They're down in the earth. And yet those who accepted being ostracized by the Jews as unclean because they were now mixing with Gentiles, they ascended to heaven. That's why in Hebrews, when it says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, he's not talking about missing church per se. He's talking about meeting together with Gentiles, which made them enemies of the Jews. He's writing to Hebrews. So he's saying, like, these people are like, oh, but if we go to church, we're there with Gentiles and we'll be persecuted. He's like, no, don't. That's a testimony to them of this new order. And that's, we can certainly apply it to today. Like, well, why aren't you a church? But the point there was they were meeting with Gentiles and they were doing exactly what Peter did, afraid to eat with the Gentiles. And, that was anti-Christian. Yeah. So that's all the little details in the parable are significant. The fact that like nothing, no strange detail in Scripture is there. There's no idle word. Everything is supposed to go, why is that there? There's a reason. What's he referring to in the Old Testament? So the rich man was acting like a king when he should have been acting like a priest. And, the dogs were unclean. They're coming and licking his sores. Dogs are scavengers. Scavengers are unclean because they eat death. Lazarus is like living death. And so it starts off with, he's like the living dead, but he becomes the dead living at the end.
Yeah, it's a total reversal. Yeah. Okay. All right. I could keep going, but we gotta move on. So you see, the end of Revelation 20 to be yet future, which, as you already pointed out, is really the difference between a partial and a full preterist. The end of Revelation 20. Yeah, sorry, not the full sequence. Yeah. But so then you go into 21 and 22, and you see that.
That's more because he returns. He gives us a vision. What's interesting is that Revelation has 7 parts, and the last part is chapters 20 to 22, and that has 7 parts. And it recapitulates the pattern of the entire book in the same way that they blew the trumpets once a day around Jericho, and then on day 7, they blew them 7 times.
7 times. There you
go.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, and the same way that all the covenants in the Bible work through the pattern of Genesis 1. So you have Adam, the Adam called to qualify as a covenant head, but he blew it. That's the day 1, judging between light and darkness in the moral realm. Noah is day 2, which is the separation of the waters. Day 3 is the land, which is Abraham and first fruits, which is Moses. Day 4 is the rulers, which is David, Solomon, etc. Day 5 is swarms and hosts of in the sky and the sea, and that's the prophets and the Gentile armies and that period. Day 6 was the Restoration era, where you had the priesthood restored, leading up to the time of Christ. But the history and Revelation works through this sevenfold pattern, because what it's doing is every one of those 7 steps grabs an element of one of those old covenants and puts it into the new. So what's happening there is Jesus is taking elements of each of those, like he's come as a thief. Like the Herods have stolen the inheritance, like the reverse of what Jacob did. So Jacob stole the inheritance from Esau. The Herods are from Esau. So was Haman in the book of Esther. So was Amalek. Jesus says, I'm coming as a thief, because he's coming to steal it back. He's Jacob, and he's like, Esau has received, he's stolen the promises. I'm coming to steal them back from you.
Steal them back.
That's why the disciples said, will you restore the kingdom to Israel?
Right.
And they weren't talking about having an earthly kingdom like David. They were saying, Edom has taken the inheritance. Are you going to give it back to the Jews? That's what they're talking about. And he says, well, I don't know the exact time, but you're going to testify here and there and there, and then it'll be given back to God's people from the Herods. He's not talking about a far-flung, restoration of the Jews or anything. He's talking about the end of Esau. So, and now I'm off the track again. What was it? Oh dear. Revelation. So basically, Revelation 20 to 23 works through the sevenfold pattern. So Jesus opens the New Covenant scroll at step 3 of the book. He opens the books of judgment at step 3 of this final section. And that's the end of this age. So the scroll begins this age, and opening the books to judge is the end of this age, but it happens at the same step in that sequence as it does in the whole book. So step 7 here is like the 7 trumpets again. So just like Jesus and the ministry of Jesus in the first fruits church grabs something from every single one of those covenants, and is like the 7 trumpets on the last day, combining them all on day 7. So Revelation itself combines all of the steps of the book into one sequence at the end. And that's why it jumps around a bit, because it does deal with the final judgment, but then he comes back to talk about the events that we're facing, that the people at the time were facing. So it's not chronological in a sense. That's why it's a bit confusing, but it is working through that pattern. Sometimes what it has in that step is the opposite of what it had in the book, because it's flipped it around. It's like, well, that's what it was because I was dealing with the evil. Now I'll give you the good version. So like it contrasts the rebellion of the Herods with the New Jerusalem, for instance. But Revelation follows the covenant pattern. I think we should probably cover that, but it's pretty basic. It's just God is the boss, who he puts in charge, what he wants them to do, what the results are, blessings and curses. And the final thing is succession, which is the next step. Those who've disobeyed have been cut off. Those who obeyed, you've inherited the land, you've inherited the future. And so the last step of Revelation is succession arrangements for those who've come through the judgment of AD 70. And this is what they've inherited. This is the new age. And this is a description of it very briefly. So not all of the book is about for the first century. God always gives us a glimpse of the future. And that's what he has at the end of the book of Revelation. And then that's when Jesus gets back to it and he's like, well, if you want this, here's what you have to do. He comes back to the audience of the day saying, this is what I've promised you, like Adam. Here's what I've promised you, dominion. This is a spiritual dominion, has physical aspects, of course, but, keep these words. This is what you have to do. That's how we understand the book. It has a standard covenant structure that works through the Bible.
Yeah, so you see all of 21 and 22 as this description of New Jerusalem, the inauguration of the church, the new covenant.
I mean, look, Paul speaks of the New Jerusalem as being present when he says, old Jerusalem's like Hagar, Egypt, down below, relying on the waters below. But Canaan relied on rain, which is the waters above, and that's Sarah. And so he contrasts the two in Galatians 4. He's just as Israel ascended from, the city below to the city above. He said, so you guys can see physical Jerusalem is still here, but that's the old city. And I know that you can't see the new city, but you're just going to have to believe me that that city is more eternal than this one, which would have been very hard to believe at the time because, they were finishing the temple and it looked like it would last forever. And then, of course, suddenly the tables are turned, literally. Jesus turned the tables once again. So, the New Jerusalem is the current reality, but the idea is that the gates are open. I think too there's a correspondence between, when it talks about when they crossed the Jordan that God made the water stand up as a wall. And the idea was that he turned, like the river itself was like a wall, but now he turned it into a gate. And so we're told that we see the crystal sea in heaven, which was pictured by the laver in the tabernacle and the sea, in the bronze sea, which is, because it's made of bronze, it's like a lake of fire. It's like, it looks fiery, but it's water. I think when the flood happened, which was the first laver, I think it was volcanic as well. So it was fire and water. I think it was like scalding hot when the fountains, like fiery water, imagine that, So, yeah, but in Revelation, you see the crystal sea and then you see a crystal city. And I think it's the same thing where it starts off as with nature as the sea, and then it becomes culture where it becomes a crystal city. So the crystal sea that we see in Exodus 24, when they went up, Moses and the elders went up on a mountain and they saw Christ walking on a sapphire pavement. Well, that has now been constructed like cutting down a tree and building a house or a tabernacle out of it. God takes the natural and then builds it into the supernatural. Like we take gold, silver, precious stones and we make something out of it. So God has now taken the crystal sea and turned it into a crystal city where it's standing up like the Jordan did as walls and gates. And it's a city where as you pass through, you're cleansed and you're now, that's why it says outside are, dogs, paws,
Yeah.
So basically the city itself is a laver. It's like a baptismal house where you pass. It's a rite of passage. In the ancients, as you know, they used to sit in the gates as the judge. Lot sat in the gate of the city as a judge. He was a righteous judge. That's why they despised him. So the New Jerusalem itself is, in a sense, we sit in the gates. The foundations are the apostles and the prophets, and then it's got walls and gates. So the idea is that whereas, if parents could no longer control their son because he was a drunkard and whatever, they had to take him to the gate, the elders in the gates, and basically take him to a higher authority because he'd grown up now and he was going to answer to a higher authority. And so they would take him to the elders in the gates, and if they couldn't deal with him, then he would be cast out of the city or stoned, or, he could be exiled. The idea with the New Jerusalem is that, there's new gates, there's spiritual gates, and that's why baptism becomes the means by which someone is put under church discipline. It's you've testified, you've been baptized. If we put you under church discipline, that's the mechanism by which you are called to repent. It goes back to the idea where I said Adam was under the sword and he was supposed to bear the sword. Israel was under the sword in Egypt. They bore the sword in Jericho. You're either under the sword of the gospel and called to repent, or you're bearing the sword of the gospel as Jesus' legal representative. So the gates of the city of the New Jerusalem are, you're either under the sword and you come in and then, you become a sword bearer, or you're kicked out and called to repent. You're under discipline. So it's a current reality. It's related to the fact that the end of Ezekiel describes spiritually the order of the Jew-Gentile order after the exile from the book of Esther onwards. It wasn't a physical temple. It's describing a social order as architecture. And so John picks up the same thing. He says, here's the architectural blueprint, and this is what God is building. And I think when it says coming down from God in heaven, it sounds like it's a continuing action, that the blueprint, we're constantly referring to that blueprint, just like Moses received the plans for the tabernacle and David received the plans for the temple. We're getting the plans and we're building that Jerusalem on earth. So and then when it's finished, once it's complete, then that's when the end will come. Yeah. So it could be a long while yet.
Yeah. Listen, I mean, when I first read this from Kenneth Gentry Jr., this idea of New Jerusalem, and it took me a little second to rewire, but I love it. I mean, I love this concept, and it actually makes sense. James B. Jordan makes a couple points about the tree of life being healing for the nations, and you already mentioned everyone outside of the city there. So it's like some of the language there doesn't really make sense with this eternal state interpretation, but with this, I just love the picture of a new heaven, new earth descending. It just kind of takes serious the ending of the old covenant and the inauguration of the new covenant.
And what I liked with Jordan is that he spends a lot of time on the prophets and the time between the exile and the first century. We tend to jump from the prophets straight to the first century. The promises in Isaiah, for instance, of the Messiah. But you have to look at the rest of the chapter and what's written around them and say, well, no, this had an initial fulfillment.
It did,
a lot of the promises of victory in battle in Isaiah are actually referring to what happened in the book of Esther. And when you look at it, you go, okay, it's not just some kind of pie in the sky promise of like they're not just riffing and just sort of making all of these, they're using symbolic language, but like when he says that they'll beat their swords into plowshares, yes, that's always, the gospel will always bring reconciliation, because we're reconciling ourselves to God, which automatically should reconcile ourselves amongst each other. But the primary reference for that is Cain and Abel. Cain was a farmer and he beat his plowshare into a sword. And so the idea of
that's crazy.
Also, what does Jesus do? He gives us his flesh and blood sword as bread and wine, plowshare. So
wow, that's crazy.
By doing that, he's doing the opposite of what Cain did, and he's turning our conflicts, but he's uniting us together in him. And he's also putting the flesh and the blood back together. When you had to drain the blood out of a sacrifice, but then when he came out of the tomb, his flesh and blood were back together. It's the same as the trees in Eden were bread and wine, basically, like the garden version of bread and wine, priesthood and kingdom. When God split humanity to prevent the same sort of intermarriage that led to the flood into priests and kings, Jews and Gentiles, they could no longer. Melchizedek brought bread and wine, but in Abraham, those two things were separated and they had to tip the wine out. You weren't allowed to drink wine with God. So basically, the bread and the wine, like flesh and blood, were separated. And it's not until the Last Supper Jesus puts them back together. So it's this whole. It's this God divides and conquers. He splits. He cuts Adam open to create his bride or construct his bride, that he then might put them back together as husband and wife. He splits Jew and Gentile in two, that he might put them back together in a better way in Christ. Divide and conquer is always how he works. It's not just Julius Caesar. God does it all the time. So once we see that there's this sort of diamond pattern, you see it in the tabernacle too. It starts with the ark, and then it splits into, priesthood and kingdom with the lampstand and the table, and then he puts them back together in the laver, and then there's an inheritance at the end of the land. So it's how he always works. So that's why another thing about God's kitchen is if he's cutting you up, it's so he can put you back together in a better way, So the bread and the wine, swords and plowshares. But the point there is that what I was going to say was that Jordan has spent so much time on understanding that era after the exile as a sort of a halfway house between the Mosaic era and the Kings, where things were pretty straightforward. A halfway house between that and the New Covenant.
Yeah.
So God scattered the Jews across the empire, and they founded synagogues everywhere. That's a lot like churches. And so Paul goes around, and it's a bit like where the disciples were sent out to the houses of Israel first to see if they were in or out of the new order. But then Paul goes around to the synagogues and says, are you in or out? It's like a Passover. Are you in or out? I think the language in Revelation draws on Ezekiel a lot because Ezekiel was kind of halfway in between. You still have the Jew-Gentile divide, but then, as I said, in Jesus, step 5 in the covenants was that era where they established synagogues everywhere. Step 5 in the first century was establishing churches everywhere and bringing synagogues in or leaving them out. And it was they were basically taking all of the glory out of each of one of those covenants of the past and putting it into the new, taking the inheritance, plundering the old order and putting the good stuff into the new and leaving out the bad stuff. So it was like plundering Egypt, or David plundering the Philistines or whoever, or Amalek, whoever it was. Jesus comes to plunder. He comes to take the lampstand. Yeah. Anyway, rambling again, but sorry.
No.
I'm thinking in pictures. I'm just telling you what I see.
No,
it's all a movie. It's all a movie. Yeah.
I'm going to try to bring this to a close, but I'm going to go ahead and go for it. I got a couple more questions that I think at this point might as well go for it. So I've got a clarifying question, which really I'd like to get a response from you on this one, and then I'll wrap up with one more. So,
Sure.
My understanding of postmillennialism prior to being exposed to your writing was what I had sent you, which is I think you referred to it as historical, but I'd always had it explained that the postmillennial view is that the millennium will be inaugurated at some point in the future once the world has been evangelized and has embraced Christianity. That would then bring in
it's still millennium, a future golden age.
Right, which would last for like a literal 1,000 years. So whenever I read your material and you're describing the millennium as, the church age, that's kind of what I've understood as the all-millennial view. And really and truly, all-millennial is post-millennial in the sense that they, too, are also looking for Christ to come at the end of the millennium, the church age.
There's not a huge difference. I think Jordan, they recognize that there's still a lot of evil in the world, and they're right to say we can't be triumphalistic. But as I said with Jordan, and then you've got post-mills who are, let's go and take dominion. And then, Jordan was kind of in that, but then he wrote an article called The Dominion Trap, which he says this is exactly the test faced by Adam. They're seizing the kingdom instead of submitting to God and overcoming Jesus' way and then receiving that inheritance as a gift. In a sense, the church doesn't have to take dominion in a sense as simply receive it as a gift. Like Adam was promised dominion. Like with Joshua, he was promised dominion, and God said, "I'll give them into your hand." There was still going to be a battle, but as we know with Jericho, like that was the start. It's like this is a sign of how I'm like a miraculous sign of how I'm going to deal with everything from now on. I'm not going to tear down the walls in a miraculous way, but this is a sign that I'm with you, and that as you go in and conquer these cities, it'll be as if the walls are just falling down before you.
Right. Yeah.
God always does that. He always does a miraculous sign, a bit like the tongues in the first century were a sign that the gospel would be translated into every tongue. Like we actually have to do the work, but it'll be as blessed as that initial sign was leading up to AD 70. So which reversed the curse of the Tower of Babel. It's like, well, I'm going to do Babel again, but in a good way. All of those separate nations that were formed, I'm now going to fill. God always forms and then fills. It's always like build the house and then move in. Days 1 to 3, forming, build the house. Days 5 to 7 or 4, 5, 6, fill. I'm going to move in. Build the tabernacle and then I move in. Day of Pentecost, they're waiting for God. He's built the house and then he comes and moves in. So that's how he works. So basically, Jordan said, our job is to be servants, to be sacrificial where possible, to be bold witnesses. But in a sense, we've just got to take the stand. We need to be involved in business and politics and all of those things. But if we think that is the mechanism, then we're making the same mistake that Israel did when it made all those treaties, when they could have just had God's power. So the Jordan reconciles amill and post-mill with the understanding that it's our sacrifice and suffering and service that conquers the world. So in a sense, suffering is not the mark of a irredeemable world, and it's the means of its conquest. So that's where the amill, both the amill and the post-mill have kind of got two halves of the story. You need to put them together and realize that the cross is what conquers. But there will be conquest, as we saw, the suffering of the martyrs and the Christians led to the conversion of Rome. So whereas the amills don't see an actual outcome in history, that's where they're wrong. It does come.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But it doesn't come through seizing power. Right. Comes through submission to God, and then God says, like Adam, I can trust you now. Here's the car keys. And then of course Rome went bad, and then God had to do it again. So, but each time he does it, as with Israel, he just keeps expanding his territory. Yeah.
So really the main difference between amill and post-mill, according to this interpretation, really is that the post-mill has the tenacity to take Jesus's words seriously, that the mustard seed will grow, and that they take that to mean kind of what it sounds like. I
mean, there's the twin errors. One, like the amill, they're just what do you call it, Postmillennialism. It's all just going to get worse and worse and worse until the end. We just have to hold on. Whereas the sin on the post-mill side is like, we can't lose. And it's like, well, no, you win by losing.
Yeah. It's somewhere.
So they're both. And it's, once again, those two, post-mill and amill, they're the two trees in the Garden of Eden, the same mistakes. One's all priestly, and it's like, no, we just have to submit and suffer, and that's our lot. We just have to be servant leaders and constantly downtrodden and whatever. And then the other guys are like, no, we're kings,
Sure.
But Jesus said, if you humble yourself, you will be exalted.
That's what he said. Wow.
So
wow.
It's a bit like the difference between, say, the Reformed and the Pentecostals. Like the Pentecostals want to harvest every week, and they'll manipulate people emotionally to get a harvest because, it's all harvest time. And it's like, no. You've got to plant and water and weed and do all those things, and then God will send a harvest. Whereas the Reformed guys are like, well, we just plant and water and weed, and we never really expect a harvest. Like we don't want any sign of emotion or mass conversions or anything. That's wrong. I was like, no, you're both getting it wrong.
Yeah.
There's a patient time, and then that's how God works. The kingdom of God it doesn't come as an invasion, it comes as a harvest.
Mm.
And that's what they need to understand, that thy kingdom come is not Jesus come and kill everybody and rescue everybody. It's your kingdom will come as a harvest. And when it arrives, it's just like the natural outcome of all that work, and it will be undeniable. When Jesus said that the fields were white to harvest in his day, that was because the synagogues had been planting seed for 500 years. And now all these Gentile believers are coming out of the woodwork because of the ministry of the synagogues. And that's why we go, why did God wait 400 years between the exile and Christ? It's like because he was planting and waiting. Same as the 400 years in Exodus. He was waiting for Israel to grow into a nation until it was ripe. So, so I think that's, there's patience. One side isn't very patient and the other side's a bit pessimistic. I think, no, both
absolutely.
kind of right.
No, that's why I love this. Like I said, I'd never heard of this type of post-mill before. So,
but it's encouraging, it's sort of like, okay,
absolutely.
We won't. As you said that you teach high school Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, that's one of those things where a lot of the time you realize that you're just planting seeds.
Right.
Like you'll see some. I was in a public high school, which was pretty hard going, but you're just getting God's foot in the door. Like you're planting seeds. If you just expect great results initially, then you're going to be disappointed. And that's where the A mills come in. They go, oh, we're just not seeing the results. It's like, be patient. God's working.
Yeah.
Like in the book of Esther, where he's not even mentioned, and yet there he is. You just see him, moving the chess pieces around.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I love that. So I guess my last question, you kind of already alluded to it. There is just a frenzy, which I can't even say it's a recent frenzy. Every generation's probably guilty of this, but certainly you talk to anybody who holds a dispensational position, we're like at the door of the final judgment and the second coming of Christ, right? Now I've heard James. I read one of James B. Jordan's books, something about Christian future of the church, something like that. I mean, he talks about the pattern and how he believed that we're at the end of a pattern. He just believes it's going to start over. You mentioned it could be a while. When I said it could be a while, I meant the actual end. Yeah, but I think he's correct. He's correct in seeing that we're at the end of a cycle. Yeah, and that was my question. Was it like, are we near the end? So I think you've answered that. As far as if we're not at the end, if we're looking at this pattern, or you call the Bible matrix, what's your take on as far as where we are in the cycle? And
I think we're at the point where, particularly, in the West generally, but especially in America, where you're seeing such a divide. You've got in the garden sense, you've got the true believers and those who don't believe. Then you've got the cultural outcome where you've got those who are more sort of conservative, and that's a mixed bag. It always is. And then you've got those who are, progressive. And once again, that's a mixed bag. There are people there who are classical sort of liberals, and then you've got the delusional, rabid, crazy leftists who are just, communists. But there is this division. And I think it is once again God. At the heart of it is Christ, in a sense. Look, once again, you've got progressives who are all for just like mercy, social justice, and they see the gospel, that side of things, whereas the conservatives are more sort of, personal responsibility, all that sort of stuff. But it does seem like there's this threshing going on. It's that God's throwing the everything up in the air, and the wind is sort of slowly carrying away the chaff. I think the seeds of the next age are always in this age, and we've seen that all the way through, where you had The testimony to Rome led to the eventual conversion of Rome. And then the European model ended up being broken up during the Reformation and spread across the world. And then eventually you've got, leading to the 18th century, where you've got missionaries going all around the planet and having great success over time. I mean, that really changed things. We're still seeing the fruit of that today. But now I think what we're seeing is that the USA, as sort of like the culmination of the West, it's such a melting pot, and such a, there's good theology in the UK, but it's a bit staid. Like, they're not really. America's wild, like you've got the best of theology and the worst of theology coming out because there's so much freedom. And that's where you have the freedom to have people like James Jordan who think outside the box. But then you've got a lot of real craziness as well. That's just a lot of people who are just totally off the rails and making up their own stuff. So, freedom comes with its blessings. Like growing up, you have more freedom, but you got more freedom to make mistakes. But I think the phrase is that God always puts his darlings on the altar. And it's, people are very critical of Mark Driscoll, rightly so, for what happened at the end. But reading his kind of ministry biography, the reason he succeeded was whenever he reached a degree of success, he would put the whole thing on the altar for the sake of more growth. He would take enormous risks. Like he said, just as things were going smoothly and everyone's happy and whatever, he's like, oh, we need to go to the next level. I'm going to take, and everyone, it's sort of like the entrepreneur. Everyone's like, what? We just got it all sorted out, and you're going to, and the thing is, he'd put a whole thing on like put it as a down payment on a bigger debt, or whatever. Sacrifice willingly, put the whole church and what he built on the altar, but it would pay off, and there would be this growth. And so my understanding of what happened to him is that, like God in the Old Testament, he keeps putting his son on the altar, including Isaac, for the sake and in Israel, for the sake of bigger growth. Israel will be put into exile for the sake of greater expansion. And that's what happens at every step. He keeps offering what he has for the sake of a bigger harvest. And that's first fruits and Pentecost. You offer a bit and then you get more. You put a seed in the ground and you get, you have seed capital, and then you make a killing. So everything's suddenly gone really dark. Looking at that's very strange. So the idea with Driscoll was he was willing to put everything on the altar until it came down to him. When the point came that he realized this has now outgrown me, I need to put myself on the altar, and then that'll be my legacy. I need to relinquish control. And he wasn't willing to do that because, that was the test. Whereas with God, it came to the point where he had to put himself on the altar in Christ, and he was willing to do that. And so I think that's how we have to understand history. At the moment, America is the model of what God has planned for the entire world in the next era, where it's a melting pot of the nations, but all together under a Christian umbrella, a Christian moral understanding that is still tolerant to other peoples and other faiths. But like with Constantine, they're kind of on the fringes. They're still under that Christian framework that gives them freedom. And I think that's what the case is. So in a sense, we can't have that unless America goes through this trial by fire to kind of sort it out. It's on the altar in a sense. God, it's and we're in the era where any country can be God's country if we obey God, any country. But the idea is that America did that, and with enormous freedom. But as always, they kind of ended up stealing the car keys, and you've got making global treaties, trying to maintain their power, which is the whole thing with the government departments at the moment. That's all coming out. Borrowing crazy amounts of money to buy off interests around the world just to maintain their power, where instead of just trusting God and sending soldiers around the world instead of missionaries, they could have conquered the world. That's how you do it. You send missionaries, you fund the missionaries, and then you don't have to use military force because God harmonizes the nations through the gospel. All the Cains and all the Abels, all the plowshares, are made from the swords. So that'll be the next era, but it'll be like the USA, but in a bigger sense. But we've just got to go through this narrow portal at this point, which is very unsettling. Yeah. So the best is yet to come. Always, the best wine is always at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I think we've given the listener a lot to chew on. If you haven't had your mind blown already, go ahead and tell us, your books that you've written and where people can get those. And I guess we'll wrap up. You can close us out in prayer.
Okay. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that there's plenty of bread to get us through the day, things that we can understand easily, things that come to us as children, just basic statements of your love and your care and your promises. But we thank you that there's also meat to chew on and plenty of wine, which can be a bit intoxicating, and we have to master our drinking habits in a sense and not get carried away, but that there are things there that have to be meditated on in order to make us wise. Thank you that we have your Spirit to guide us into all truth. Thank you that it's a group project where we all need each other. We all have different observations, and it's your Spirit that brings fellowship between us as we learn to harmonize these things and understand them. Help us to be charitable in any sort of doctrinal conflict, knowing that we are brothers, and that as we submit to you and to your word, that you will shed light on these things over time, and that you are instructing us through these times of questioning because you've got something bigger for us to do, that you want sons who are wise and just and merciful, and you have a great future for us. Help us to understand these things and to continue in our daily trust, knowing that we are dependent upon you for everything. And we thank you that all of those things come to us through your Son. We pray in his name. Amen.
Amen. Man, yeah, so thank you so much for coming on. I didn't mean to end so abruptly. I wanted to give you the opportunity to share with the listener where they can get your books and, what other books you've written besides the Revelation one.
Yep. Yeah, if you go to biblematrix.com.au, make sure you put the AU on the end, biblematrix.com.au. There's a link to my Amazon page, which has all the books, and they're gradually getting better. It's one of those things, like the matrix pattern's all about improving over time. There's lots of blog posts, and there's a link to Theo magazine, which has some sort of expanded fun, like basic primer stuff on symbolism and biblical structure. So that's in the link at the top of the page as well. But yeah, biblematrix.com.au is kind of the hub. That's the place to visit.
Good deal. All right. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. I'd love to have you back on, maybe to talk about something else. It'll be shorter. This is definitely the longest.
Something weirder.
Something weirder, yeah. I think we checked the weird one on this one, though. I mean, I think this is so different from how people have talked and heard the Book of Revelation being taught and interpreted. That I think it's unfortunately it's out there as weird. But we'll go ahead and sign off on this one. If for the listener, if you've made it this far, like I said, this is probably the longest episode I've ever done, but I've enjoyed it, man. I wanted to do it right, and man, you gave us so much.
Wow! What time? Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, we have been at it for a while.
We've been at it for a while.
Look, you could keep asking questions, and I would just keep answering them until I probably starve to death. That's just how I am.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and I guess I'll just say, this is it for the listener.
It's been great fun. Thanks. But just one more thing too is I love questions. So if people want to contact me, and quite a few people do, there's people I'm kind of discipling from a distance and sharing resources and things. If they have questions, then feel free to contact me through the website.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right, man. Well, I really enjoyed it. It's
Yeah, good.
It's been good.
And you're a good interviewer. You're a good
thank you.
interviewer. Well done.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. Cool. All right. Well, I'll let you enjoy your afternoon. I'm going to bed, man. I'm like, I'm
Good
super
one.
tired right now. It's past midnight.
Yes, I bet you are. Okay.
All right, man.
Thanks, Samuel.
Well, I'll
Good
keep
on
in
you.
touch. Hopefully, we'll talk again soon.
Yep. Beauty.
All right.
Good on you. See you, brother.
All right. Bye. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with somebody you know. And with that being said, we'll catch you on the next one.